Chapter 973. Slatak took out a diamond. He had once spent at least 200 gold drogos on this gem. "Oh, to look," he said to Lavis in a tone of certainty. He was talking about a powerful magic grandmaster who was famous for twisting magic energy into various shapes. Although the spells invented by that mage were lacking in detail, they were indeed unique in terms of durability and power. But looking at the adventurer team that didn't have many people to begin with, Slatak couldn't help but hesitate whether he should waste such a precious treasure. He tapped the diamond between his fingers and inconspicuously put it back into his pocket. Then he took out a piece of crystal. "Oh, to look," he said again. Blasphemy priests didn't cast spells like warlocks or mages. They usually needed to complement each other with incantations, casting gestures, and spell materials. Warlocks might be better. The reason why they could mobilize magic energy was because they stole an extremely small part of the authority from the gods. Their casting process, to be honest, was very similar to the process of shopping from a vending machine. Choose the right product, spell, put in money, casting materials, and click the confirm button. Read the name of the spell. Then, everything could be handed over to the vending machine, the authority of the gods. Because any god had the power to change reality, even for some gods who didn't wield the authority of magic, as long as it didn't exceed a certain limit. Just like how you couldn't count on the god of orcs, Gyush, to cast Karsi's investiture of the gods. The gods could easily cast some simple spells. Odaluk's frozen magic ball was naturally included in this. When Slatak, the leader of the blasphemy priests, chanted the name of the spell, the small piece of crystal in his hand disappeared. A crystal-clear magic ball instantly appeared above the head of the snake-scorpion demon who was constantly torturing the Glabrizu. Namuku's movements were out of shape in an instant. Frost climbed onto the joints and muscles of the greater demon like a snake. The Glabrizu wasn't affected. This Thanner-wreathed demon from the bottomless abyss seized the opportunity and punched the snake-scorpion demon's fat face. The two demons began to fight each other at close range. Not only that, but some other blasphemy priests and drows also began to cast their spells. One of them took out a hemp rope and summoned a magical rope to bind the barb demons summoned by the snake-scorpion demons. Another put on snakeskin gloves inlaid with sharp nails and used Bigsby's grappling palms to catch the Barma demons that were charging towards them because they were obstructed from killing the barb demons. Another took out a small tin bucket, but that fellow was slapped by Slatak. "Idiot, don't use the earth-splitting spell," Slatak growled angrily. "Don't destroy this secret room." Most of the remaining spellcasters began to buff their warriors with more buff spells. Bull's Strength, Bear's Endurance, Cat's Grace, Owl's Insight, Lion's Courage. This was similar to the treatment enjoyed by the Army of the Scale of Perpetual Order. However, most of the spellcasters here were unable to cast AoE buffs. They could only enchant a few powerful warriors. Just as these guys were preparing for the attack, Keys' adventurer team was also having a discussion. However, the only one who took the motley crew seriously was the dwarven underground digger. The others either knew or had roughly guessed the identity of the young blue dragon, or simply naive optimists who didn't take the enemies in front of them seriously. "Charge out," Galindo Millennium suggested. But his companions looked at him. They did not understand. "The way of the dwarves," he explained. "When there is no way out, lower your head and charge out." Jarlaxle stole a glance at Keys and found that he had just taken out a piece of parchment and was writing and drawing. He was carefully describing the various structures of the magic eye in the center of the House of Gold. The mercenary leader quickly rejected the dwarf's suggestion. "There are too many of them. It's not easy to charge out. I guess the reason why they haven't attacked yet is because they are blocked by the monsters that Mr. Keys has just summoned. Secondly, they are afraid of destroying the structure of the secret chamber. And we could take advantage of this." "Bearded gnomes," the dwarf muttered softly, but he did not deny the dark elf's words. "So, shall we start the destruction here? Let's see if we can get them to open up a path." Hearing the word destruction, the halfling framer Calder's eyes lit up. He took out a paper bag from one of his small pouches, and the sound of stones colliding with each other could be heard. "Now, let's do something exciting." After that, without waiting for the others to question, Calder took out 4 stones from the paper bag. This halfling's fingers were more agile than most thieves in the world. He did not need to look. Just by the touch of his fingertips, he knew that the shape of the stones was exactly what he wanted. At the same time, he also knew their color. Red, he said. That's right. He swung his arm, and the 4 stones flew out from between his fingers. They crossed a distance of dozens of yards and landed among the towering heavy infantry in the front row of the wandering Drow clan's army, and then exploded. Rumble, blasting stone, the essential core of many ingenious traps. He winked at the dwarf beside him and threw a new blasting stone into the dwarf's hand. The startled Grinder hurriedly let go of the shield and battle axe in his hand, and carefully used his palm to support the dangerous object that seemed like it could explode at any time. The stone will shatter. You're going to, before he could say the word murder, the dwarf immediately sucked in a cold breath. He was so nervous that he did not have time to react when his toe was hit by the heavy shield. The halfling smiled at him embarrassedly, then bent down and used both hands to pick up the dwarf's battle axe. "Lend it to me," Calder said. He then picked out a few more stones from the craft paper bag, but these stones did not have edges. Instead, they looked like flat stone pancakes. "This is a gift from the kind Earth Elemental Senior Monarch Sunnis to the world. Many of the guard traps I set up before you used them. If I have to give them a name, I'll call them Origin Stones." It's a homophone, huh? Calder didn't know what he was thinking, but he actually laughed at himself. However, his hands are not idle. He placed the stones on the ground and smashed them one by one with the dwarf's battle axe. Earth-yellow smoke drifted out of the oars in an instant, and a sharp stalagmite quickly grew out of each broken oars. The halfling quickly jumped back, but the stalagmites were still growing at a speed that should not have appeared in nature. In the end, they turned into elemental creatures. "Go fight them." Calder excitedly pointed at the wandering Drow army. The earth elemental creatures seemed to understand the halfling's words in an instant, although they did not, and they moved forward in the direction he pointed. Every step the enormous elemental creature took would produce a rumbling sound similar to the explosion that had just occurred. Chapter 974. Small guy do big things. Keyes glanced at Calder's actions and made a victory gesture to his fellow adventurer. Then, he once again immersed himself in the work of tracing the magic eye in the middle of the House of Gold. Although this spirit-binding tower was destined to be destroyed, the knowledge that built its core should not be buried. He was going to record it down and make it part of his collection. The others also looked at the great framer in a new light. Even Grinder Millennium, who originally thought that his side was at a disadvantage in terms of numbers, had to admit that in the face of the 7 or 8 fearless and over 15 feet tall rock giants, it seemed that the wandering drows were the ones at a disadvantage. The leader of the Dark Elf mercenaries, Jia, even added a new content to his life motto: never underestimate any halfling that looks harmless. Jarlaxle silently remembered this motto in his heart. "I'll show off my skills too." Seeing that his companion was praised by the Lord, the orc druid Marsh Fezzik immediately thought and quickly put his thoughts into action. He took out a small obsidian pendant. In the middle of the obsidian, there was a piece of amber that seemed to be wrapped in brown-yellow silk. As he chanted instead of the usual summoning chant of the druids, a small but ferocious-looking 8-legged beast suddenly walked out of a cloud of yellow-green smoke. Under its golden fur were strong muscles and muscles. A gold-swallowing beast. Seeing this fierce little monster, the dwarf digger Grinder Millennium was the first to react. Out of instinct, the traditional dwarf pointed a shield and axe at the monster, but then he remembered the characteristics of the little monster, so he quickly hid his metal weapons behind his back and tried to hide behind Marsh Fezzak's body. Hopefully, that druid is more reliable. The dwarf thought to himself. The gold-swallowing beast was an aggressive creature. Except for the mating stage, they were basically alone for their whole life. Adult gold-swallowing beasts regarded the area 1 to 2 miles around their nest as their hunting ground and mercilessly drove away other hunters. In addition to fresh meat, gold-swallowing beasts liked to gnaw on metals, especially gold and copper, but it was unknown whether it was to sharpen their teeth or for nutritional needs. The metal-swallowing beast's lair could extend for thousands of feet, often deep underground. The greedy appetite of the gold-swallowing beasts earned them the nickname of Gold Engorger among the dwarves. And because of these dangerous beasts, the dwarves lost more than one miner. However, even though the gold-swallowing beast was very dangerous, there were still some dwarves who would spend a lot of money to buy their cubs and train them from young. This was because after they grew up, they could easily hunt down the more despicable rust monsters. Some dwarven clans would feed the gold-swallowing beasts with less pure gold, so that they would willingly help the dwarves guard the storage room where the steel weapons were stored. Don't worry, Cha-Cha won't be interested in your equipment, at least not here. The orc druid walked up and patted the furry head of the gold-devouring beast. This metal-swallowing beast was only 3 feet long, but it weighed over 200 pounds. This was because its entire body was filled with muscles and heavy, tough bones. Its fur was golden, and its claws were black. There's more food here that it's interested in. Marsh Fezzik looked back at the dwarven underground digger and said with certainty. The metal-swallowing beast also opened its mouth and let out a roar similar to that of a leopard cat, indicating that it was indeed so. The druid whispered a few words in its ear, and the little monster actually nodded after hearing it, and then quickly ran to the corner of the House of Gold. Not only was that place far away from the confrontation between the adventurer team and the wandering drow clan, but even the battle between the demons and the demons did not affect that place. Soon, the members of the adventurer team all understood why it was called Cha-Cha. It began to gnaw on the gold foil stuck to the wall. Its hard and sharp teeth gnawed on the gold foil, and a large piece was torn off at once. And if it bit on the stone wall behind the gold foil, the latter did not seem to be harder than a cake. As it continued to gnaw, its teeth would make a crunching sound as it chewed on the metal. If a visual analogy had to be made, then the gold foil was like dust, and the metal-swallowing beast was like a vacuum cleaner robot. With its 8 powerful legs, it firmly clung to the wall and swallowed the gold foil with great efficiency. When it encountered the gold strands that connected the wall to the magic eyeball in the middle of the room, it swallowed them like noodles. The metal-swallowing beast's gnawing efficiency was so fast that a considerable area of gold foil on the wall was soon swallowed into its stomach. Fortunately, Keys had just finished drawing the magic circle on the surrounding wall. If the two were done at the same time, the young blue dragon's drawing speed would probably not be faster than the metal-swallowing beast's gnawing speed. Stop the metal-swallowing beast! Slatak roared with his eyes wide open. The leader of the blasphemy priests not only heard the noise made by the metal-swallowing beast, but also saw the mottled wall after the gold foil was missing. Attack, attack, clean up all those guys. The candle-headed earth goblin ordered loudly. Then he took out a short dart smeared with wasp and viper venom and threw it in the direction of the metal-swallowing beast. Melf's acid arrow. As soon as the short dart was thrown, it turned into a long arrow made of yellow-green liquid. This strong acid could not corrode the gold foil on the wall, but it had a great restraining effect on the metal-swallowing beast. The acid burned off their beautiful metallic hair, leaving ugly bald spots on their fur. He didn't use spells such as Scorching Metal or Rusting Spell. These spells worked directly on metal and had no effect on the metal-swallowing beast. It could be seen that Slatak was quite accomplished in the field of magic, and he had seen enough. Seeing the Melf's acid arrow approaching, the metal-swallowing beast, Cha-Cha, was so scared that its hair stood on end. It quickly swung its 8 strong legs and ran far away on the gold foil wall, avoiding the spell that might disfigure it. Then it looked at the orc druid Marsh Fezzik with dissatisfaction and roared again, as if it was blaming its own poop picker for not blocking the arrow for it. At the same time, the earth elemental creature, summoned by the halfling with the stone, was also fighting with the Taurens and dark elves. Calder immediately moved his eyes away from the metal-swallowing beast. Wherever there was a big commotion, he would go there. Chapter 975. There was no magic, no divine spells. When the Taurens and the earth elemental creatures collided, it was purely a contest of strength. The earth elementals summoned by Calder were all heavy and stubborn creatures made of stone or mud. When they were completely still, they looked like a pile of stones or a small hill. When the earth elementals began to move slowly, in fact, their movements could still make some changes. Although they might not be as agile as other elemental creatures of the same size, they were not slow when attacking. These earth elementals were not all the same in appearance. They looked like land animals made of stone, mud, or even crystal with diamond-like eyes. Among them, the larger earth elementals often had the appearance of a stone humanoid creature, which looked more hard. On the other hand, the smaller earth elementals had traces of plant growth on some parts of their bodies. They did not have the same armor and weapons as the torrents. The earth elementals relied on their own bodies to defend and attack. Not only did they have many sharp flints on the surface of their bodies, but they could also easily perform terrible blows. The Taurens waved their axes or halberds and hit them on the earth elementals. Sometimes they could only knock off some stone fragments, and sometimes they happened to break some important parts of their bodies. But as long as the earth elementals stood on the ground, those injuries would be healed. There were also some Taurens who wanted to push them down, but at this time, those monsters would discover how deceptive the appearance of the earth elementals was. They did not care at all whether it was their buttocks or their heads that fell on the ground. At worst, they could just randomly change their appearance to solve the problem. Every time a Tauren warrior pushed down an earth elemental, they would immediately find that the creature would stand in front of them in a different form. Disperse these elemental creatures. The Drows and the blasphemy priests knew how to deal with the elemental creatures and began to put their ideas into action. More than 20 Taurens alone could not defeat, or more accurately, could not defeat in a short time, these creatures that came from the inner elemental plane to the material plane. The power that supported their movements was the magic that surged from their bodies. Unless they found the magic gem that was usually hidden in the core of their bodies, they could not be completely killed. Of course, the army of Zhu'er's wandering clan was not without merit. After carefully assessing the situation, the Dark Elves immediately circled around the battlefield of the Taurens and Earth Elementals, as well as the demons and devils. They attacked the real threat, preparing to deal with the adventurer team that Keys had formed. "Prepare for battle," Galindo Millennium shouted. This dwarf digger, who had been through a lot of training, was able to distinguish the vibration of a specific frequency when a drow stepped on the ground from the messy footsteps in the House of Gold. That was the unique combat footwork of the drow's martial arts. Most of the foreign races who had seen it did not have the chance to tell others what had happened to them, because they had all died in assassination attempts. Dang, dang. Raising the shield in his hand, Grinder's body shot out like a cannonball. Two curved daggers appeared out of nowhere and smashed into both sides of the shield. "Caught you!" Garindo shouted excitedly. This dwarf was much heavier than the drow assassin had imagined, so the latter's attack was not able to lift the shield. Moreover, this was not the only error in judgment. Another, more serious error in judgment caused his two calves to be permanently separated from his knees. The subterranean digger used its battle axe to cut off the leg cleanly. Without support, the drow assassin screamed and fell to the ground. Born of a noble family, he wanted to use a levitation spell to escape, but Grinder was faster than him. The dwarf took 2 steps forward and smashed the armor-piercing awl on the handle of his battle axe into the drow assassin's throat. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The other drow did not care if their companions were dead or alive. Just as Grinder was about to continue fighting, they all aimed at the digger and pulled the trigger of the crossbows in their hands. Only one arrow, coincidentally, hit the side of Grinder's thigh, where his defense was slightly lacking. The dwarf immediately felt numbness at the base of his thigh. Following that, the scene in front of his eyes began to sway, a sign that he had been hit by a paralyzing poison. Sand crumbles, the digger cursed. The reason he had the time to curse was because he wanted to thank his teammates. Seeing that Grinder had been shot, the halfling did not continue watching. The hupak staff that he usually used as a weapon and a crutch immediately turned into a large slingshot. Cauldron moved the strap of the slingshot and threw explosive rocks at the various corners where Grinder had been shot. He did not want to engage in a sniper duel with his opponent in the middle. It did not matter if his shots were not accurate, the explosions could still kill the enemy. Just as the great framer transformed into a suppressive firepower, Jarlaxle suddenly appeared beside Grinder. The mercenary leader dodged the subterranean digger's axe because he was dizzy and could not tell who Jarlaxle was. "Drink this, and you won't have to worry about the poison on the drow's crossbow anymore." As he spoke, the dark elf threw a small leather pouch to the dwarf. In a battle, there was no need to doubt him. Grinder used his teeth to bite open the cork of the leather pouch and drank the contents in one gulp. The taste of the liquid was not very friendly to dwarves, but it tasted like a mixture of grass juice and sweet fermented rice wine. As soon as it entered the dwarf's stomach, he felt a burning sensation in his originally numb wound, and then he felt pain again. Pain was much stronger than numbness. Grinder Millennium knew this simple truth. His vision was no longer dizzy. He reached out to grab the arrow in his thigh and pulled it out. Dwarves were extremely resilient creatures. Their bodies were much better than humans, so this small arrow wound would not affect them too much. It might even have formed a scab by the end of the battle. Thus, he roared and continued to rush towards the 3 drow assassins who were sneaking up on him. Seeing that their concealment had failed, they immediately shot their crossbows at Grinder again. A crossbow bolt streaked across the dwarf's cheek, but to the surprise of the drows, the dwarf did not seem to be affected by the poison. In fact, there was still pain, but the scorching pain stimulated Grinder's desire to fight. The subterranean digger brandished its battle axe and turned into a monster like a meat grinder, quickly chopping the drows into pieces. In the end, when he wanted to pull out his axe from the chest of an unlucky dwarf, he had to step on the dwarf to pull out his weapon. Chapter 976. The battle was not going well, and Sterek was very upset. The destruction caused by the battle in the House of Gold made the Earth Goblin, who had transformed into a half-tower creature, incomplete wax demon, feel very distressed. Loltha's binding cloth. The chief blasphemy priest cursed in a low voice. He could not help but untie a leather pouch at his waist, pulled out the cork, and took a big gulp of stinky brew. This was the product of the Earth Goblins mixing animal musk glands, rotten meat, pungent plants, and any other stinky substances together in a pot. After those things were boiled, they were mixed into a sticky alchemy paste that could be attached to anything it touched. Usually, only the Earth Goblins would drink it. Lavis, who was standing close to him, smelled the stinky brew. The Spider Queen resisted the physiological reaction of vomiting and quickly cast a detoxification spell on herself. "Are you crazy? You can launch this thing into the enemy and use it as a biological weapon," Lavis growled in disgust. She was really disgusted just now. The drow's sense of smell can't withstand such destruction. Sterek chuckled and said, "Maybe." The candle above his head emitted a lot of misty smoke, which changed the color and shape of the flame from orange to yellowish green. It floated above the candle wick like a fireball. Evil power gathered in the flame, and the candle began to melt and gradually covered the body of the blasphemy priest. The blasphemy priest became an incomplete wax demon. This monster with no fixed form looked like a huge melted wax block. 8 thick tentacles stretched out from the lump of flesh, and sharp knife-like teeth grew directly at the front of the giant exposed stomach. More figuratively, he now resembled an amorphous, muddy monster, looking like a melting, 7-foot-tall candle. There was a blood-red eyeball embedded in his body. 8 tentacles that looked like whips were wriggling around him, stirring up a furious storm that was spluttering noises. Judging from the appearance alone, the wax demon that Sterek had transformed into was definitely one of the stronger ones of his kind. However, there was a reason why it was called incomplete. Unlike the maids that the goddess of Lolth created with succubi in the beginning, the wax demons that the goddess of Lolth used castrated land goblins to create had a certain degree of disability. Normally, a wax demon had 4 forms: the gaseous form, the wax demon form, the spider form, and the beautiful form. But this kind of incomplete wax demon could at most turn into the first two. They could not turn into large black widow spiders or dark elves. It was because of this that they were mercilessly abandoned by the Spider Queen, who had always been paranoid about perfection, and after sacrificing so much for the goddess. But they did not get any pity, and all the monsters led by Sterek became blasphemy priests. Take care of my things. After turning into the wax demon form, Sterek couldn't carry any of his clothes, weapons, or magic items. He used this kind of monster's innate spell to control a drow and made it put away all his things. Then this guy rolled up a small box from his pocket with a whip-like arm and hid it in his body. Hurry up and use your evocation spells. Don't use other spells, enchantments, and the like. Don't waste my time. Using vague words, Sterek decisively issued an order to the spellcasters of the Wandering Drow clan. What the hell are you doing? Lavis scolded. Sterek ignored her. Instead, he turned into a cloud of smoke and floated to the side of the earth elementals that were fighting with the Tauren. He went into the body of the earth elemental that was the tallest and most similar to a humanoid creature. Then, he turned into a wax demon form and wantonly shuttled through the earth elemental's body. He found a magic gem that provided energy and bit it. Crack! The earth elemental disintegrated in an instant. Following his demonstration, the other blasphemy shamans all transformed into melted wax demons. Instead of using their spells to deal with the troublesome earth elemental creatures, the earth elemental creatures were quickly wiped out. At the same time, the drow sorcerers also found that it was easier for them to cast evocation spells such as fireballs and lightning. Their destructive power was also stronger. That guy is mobilizing the power of the soul binding tower. Keyes had just finished drawing the last stroke on the parchment. He keenly noticed the changes on the battlefield and inferred what tricks the opponent was using. However, the young blue dragon was also puzzled. The blasphemy priest was using the power of the soul binding tower. It was not only beneficial to the spellcasters of the Wandering Drow clan. Sterek made the magic energy in the House of Gold active, and the explosive stones launched by the halfling calder with his slingshot were also much more powerful. Needless to say, the Tana Reet demons summoned by the opponent had been wiped out. Now, they had turned their attention to the snake-scorpion demons and Hamar demons. These two demons from the 9 prisons of Bader had almost no restrictions in using their innate spells in this environment. Even Keyes could feel the magic power in his body becoming restless. Because the total amount of magic power was too large, the increase was actually not enough, but it was still there. Strange? Keyes did not think that the opponent was unaware of this. He said to the other members of the adventurer team, "Let's retreat a little, they may be up to something." Before his voice trailed off, all the wax demons had wiped out the earth elemental creatures. Sterek then used his long whip-like arm to take out the small box that he had prepared before. He used his other arm to unscrew the lock on the box and opened it. Inside the box was a small piece of black stone. A buzzing sound rang in everyone's ears. The two sides immediately noticed a strange scene. The drow sorcerers could not use any spells. When they threw a fireball, a puff of green smoke came out of their hands. The orc druid Marsh Fezzik, who was in the form of a shark lizard, suddenly felt dizzy. His reason gradually disappeared, as if he had turned into a real shark lizard. Jarlaxle threw out his flying daggers, but the daggers that should have automatically returned to their scabbards remained in the enemy's body. The explosive stones launched by Calder with his slingshot had all turned into ordinary pebbles. Dead magic area? He suddenly realized. He knew that this was not the effect of an anti-magic field spell. The blasphemy priest had temporarily turned the entire House of Gold into a dead magic area. Chapter 977. We should be able to find another stalagmite, right? Calder asked, his voice tinged with fear. The convenient traps that required magical energy to operate were all unable to be activated due to the dead magic area, and the halfling began to worry about his unknown fate. Just now, they had relied on a stalagmite to successfully take care of a Tauren, but when the Tauren fell to the ground, the stalagmite fell as well. "Be careful," Grinder reminded him instead of replying. As he spoke, the dwarf raised his shield and stomped on it with a huge hoof, sending the tyrant flying. Grinder endured the pain from the collision, readjusted his steps, adjusted his helmet, and spat on the ground. "I found another suitable stalagmite," Grinder said loudly, and then made a throat-slitting gesture at the evil tyrant, provoking him. "Now you've pissed me off, you swollen longhorn monster." The tyrant was a monster that was easily angered. Although the dwarf did not tease him with a red cloth, the tyrant still rushed towards Grinder with its head lowered. The dwarf immediately ran to the side, and the tyrant followed closely behind him. The monster stepped into the trap without a mistake, and a rope made of elastic and tough leather was tied around the tauren's ankle. The faster he ran, the stronger the pulling force when the rope contracted. The huge pulling force caused him to trip, and his head hit the ground hard. His body was also involuntarily dragged toward the stalagmite tied to the rope. "Go to hell!" Accompanied by an angry roar, a dwarf's arrow, commonly known as a flying axe, struck the center of the tauren's cheek with a clang. The blade of the axe severed the tauren's central nervous system, causing the monster to die instantly. In the adventurer team, the two dwarves did not even have time to celebrate before they found more taurens appearing beside them. "Sandstorm," Grinder cursed under his breath. Not only were the two of them in a tough battle, but the rest of the adventurer team was also in the same situation. Jarlaxle, the leader of the Dayad Independent mercenary group, brandished his two long swords as he fought with his comrades. Although he was stronger and more agile, the number of enemies was enough to wipe out the advantage brought by his superior martial skills. Moreover, he was not used to not having the help of magic tools. Marsh, who had transformed into a shark lizard beast, was also confronting a powerful enemy. At this moment, he didn't have much rationality left. Most of the time, he was relying on his instincts to dodge and attack. However, his opponent was even crazier than him. It was a drow in spider form. Without the restraints of magic, it could only act on its bloodthirsty impulse. Only Keys' situation was slightly better. The wailing short musket and the electromagnetic assault rifle could still be used normally in the death magic zone. Every time he pulled the trigger, he would take the lives of one or more enemies. However, the young blue dragon also had other troubles. He didn't dare to transform into the Megalosaurus form, which was more suitable for battle. Because of Steric's actions, to be honest, Keys really didn't expect that the leader of the blasphemous priests would have a treasure that could create a death magic zone. In the center of the spirit-bound tower, the magic eye that was constructed with the perfect soul prism as the core began to emit a dark red and light red light, as if it was blinking. It was a powerful magic item by itself. The technology used to create it could very well have been borrowed from a group of 7 liches from a distant crystal wall system. They had used certain principles to create the evil divine artifact known across the multiverse, the Clinchinian, broken magical crystal. Although the core of the spirit-bound tower didn't give birth to an intelligence like Clinchinian, it was just not yet and not impossible. At least, Keys had already received a warning from the Dragonhead Warhammer. This magical weapon, named Hammer by the young blue dragon, was embedded with a complete mice energy core as its core. It possessed self-awareness, and it had just sent a warning to its master. Something's wrong. Keys thought about Hammer's warning. Now, in the death magic zone, this magic item is like a person standing on the edge of a cliff, eager to find a way to save himself. Previously, when it was connected to the Ashen world, it attracted and digested the souls of the dead, and it had lost control of the original channel. It is building a new energy supply channel on its own. The souls of the people who died in the House of Gold, powerful magic, psionic power, all may give it inspiration. It doesn't like order. This is the after effect of the same manufacturing technology as Clinchinian. If it succeeds and can build an energy supply channel on its own, it is very likely that it will not obey any will, and it will grow and spread by instinct. The reminder from the Dragonhead Warhammer finally made Keys understand. He finally understood why the ancient soul-binding sorcerer had likely mastered most of the technology to create Clinchinian, but did not give it artificial intelligence. The reason was very simple. If the core of the spirit-bound tower, made with Clinchinian's technology, got rid of control, it was very likely to transform into something with incredible destructive power, like the naughty child. The young blue dragon, who had already regarded the Ashen world as his exclusive property, would not let the naughty child destroy this world. Therefore, he not only had to restrain his impulse to transform into a megalosaurus, as Hammer had mentioned. Any spell he used here might give the core of the spirit-bound tower inspiration and complete the last step of self-reconstruction, but he also had to find a way to defuse this time bomb as soon as possible. There were enough spirit-bound towers in the Ashen world to maintain the normal operation of the world. Since this brand-new spirit-bound tower, which was about to be born and targeted by the Demon Lord, had the possibility of destroying the world, Keyes naturally could not let it be born smoothly. The problem was that defusing a bomb was a technical job. He could not use spells or psionic messages to send reinforcements from the scales of Eternal Order Chamber of Commerce. Nor could he ignore the crazy attacks launched by the wandering Drow clan army on the adventure team. If he wanted to dismantle the core, he was really a little busy for the time being. Bang! Bang! 2 shotgun shells fired from the wailing short musket hit the body of a wax demon that was sneaking up on him, and it was knocked back. Then he pulled off the ring of a white phosphorus incendiary bomb and threw it into the wriggling body of the monster. Without the protection of magic, the half-tower's fire resistance was reduced a lot, and soon it became a real candle. But even if they dealt with an enemy so quickly, in the face of the large number of the enemy and the possibility of more backup troops coming at any time, this was in Zar City. It was still a little inadequate. It would take a lot of effort to get rid of all the enemies. Chapter 978. How much longer are those fellows going to dawdle? Sitting in a booth in the Montney Donnell fast food restaurant, he ordered a milkshake with bacteria, a strong diarrhea fries, a stinky steak burger, a Sawajan sandwich, and other signature delicacies. The slug-like 7th Lord Barzab was waiting for the daring servant to come and ask him for a tip. This fast food restaurant was a famous restaurant in the 9 prisons of Bader. One could find more than one branch in almost every level of the 9 prisons and in every major city. Regardless of whether it was the Batsid Devil or those mortals who enter by mistake or just recklessly, as long as they had calamity coins, anyone could spend money here. Of course, the prerequisite was that the person could find the 2 adjacent sulfur mountains and had the guts to walk toward the lava lake below the suspension bridge connecting the 2 mountains. Then, he would be able to see the real entrance of the Montney Donnell fast food restaurant. It's so delicious that you can lick my leg. Barzab sneered. With his current appearance, what leg could he lick? This was an advertisement that involved false advertising. The 7th Lord was prepared to teach the Montney Donnell Company a lesson. In the 9 hells, that fellow still hasn't left. In the back kitchen of the fast food restaurant, Reynolds' head popped out from a pot. This fellow's appearance looked a little like the slime lord of the bottomless abyss, Julius. Many devils were guessing whether there was a bloodline connection between the 2. However, this fellow with crimson, slippery skin was indeed a proper Batsa devil. Furthermore, he was a very powerful devil count. Unlike the other demon nobles, Reynolds was an elite, unique demon with a unique appearance. He was different from the basic promotion sequence of Batsu, but he did not have a specific target to serve. Or, to be more precise, Reynolds was the vassal of several lords of Bader at the same time. This was all thanks to his fast food restaurants all over the 9 hells. The temporary lord of Avernus, Bayer, conferred him the title of Devil Count because he needed to use taxes to subsidize military expenses. Dis's Lord Despat was the raw material supplier of MacDonald, and in order to ask for more rebates, the 2nd Lord also conferred him the title of Devil Count. In Stygia, Reynolds was also an earl, and the 2 upheavals, Pay the Bill and the Shame of Gagnon, did not affect his position at all because he kept spending money to buy ice from Stygia to ensure the cold chain transportation of fast food restaurants. In short, Reynolds' noble status came from the influence of the fast food chain he operated. Relying on the influence of the fast food chain, he was able to transfer benefits to many lords of Bator and constantly add items to their treasuries. Among the 9 prisons of Bator, the only one he did not have much contact with was Barzub, who was on the 7th floor of Maladomini. From Reynolds' point of view, this bug overlord couldn't be judged by common sense. Maladomini had the most suitable business environment for fast food restaurants in the 9 hells. The Batsu devil who lived here had always been in the process of constantly migrating. This was because their somewhat neurotic lord always liked to build new capital cities. Every time he built a capital city, he would feel that it was not perfect enough, so he would build a new one elsewhere. Due to their thirst for promotion and their greed for power, the demons of Maladomini would follow their lord to the new capital, to the new center of power, unless they couldn't bear to part with the power they had established in their old land. Under such circumstances, as long as MacDonald chose the right location, it would be easy to gain a foothold and squeeze a considerable amount of money from the money bags of the demons who were busy migrating. In addition, in the process of building the city, Barzub would also kidnap architects and craftsmen from various races from all over the multiverse. These people were not like demons, and eating was not a necessary requirement for demons. They had an objective need to eat. Throughout the 9 hells, other than the canned food prepared by the logistics department of the Bloody Battle Frontline Society, only the food provided by the McTagney fast food restaurant could satisfy the delicate stomachs and digestive systems of the mortals. It was because the market prospects here were very good that Reynolds had long wanted to establish a partnership with the Bug Overlord. He had wanted to use the same method of dealing with other lords, using rich taxes, various visible and invisible rebates, as well as a good service system to persuade Barzub to support the development of his business here. However, the Bug Overlord rejected him. The reason was laughable. Barzub thought that the food provided by McDonald, or the fast food restaurant itself, was not presentable. Not to mention opening a restaurant in the new capital city that he had chosen, the existence of McDonald's fast food restaurant in any city in Maladomini, even if it was an old and broken city that had been abandoned for tens of thousands of years, would affect the city's imperfect appearance. Although Reynolds relied on his relationship with other lords of the 9 hells and his own strength to operate hundreds of fast food restaurants in Maladomini, the number of stores was not only incomparable to the number of stores in the other planes of the 9 hells. Reynolds had a huge scale of more than 20,000 stores on the 2nd level of Dis, and he had more than 3,000 stores in the dangerous area of Avernus. But the location of his stores was also forced to choose a very remote place in Maladomini, far away from the city and the various main roads. It could be imagined just how deep the grudge this demon count, the head of the largest chain business in the Bardo 9 hells, held against Barzub was. Although he certainly did not dare to openly challenge a lord, he had already scolded him idiot behind his back many times. Despicable slug, you're even worse than the ooze, Reynolds cursed in his heart. The ooze could still be used by him and could be summoned to process some special ingredients, but the slug was simply useless. Reynolds lost control of his emotions in anger. His doppelganger, thanks to his own special characteristics, Reynolds could leave a part of his body in every fast food restaurant to direct the operation of the restaurant, climbed out of the big crucible, grabbed a sausage that was 6 to 7 feet long and as thick as an adult's wrist on the chopping board, and viciously threw it at a servant in the kitchen. The servant, who had the upper body of a mortal and the lower body of a demon with 7 to 8 thick octopus-like tentacles, was sent flying by the heavy blow and landed in a big cauldron filled with special ooze sauce. Before the unlucky demon could climb out of the cauldron, the ooze that Reynolds had carefully cultivated corroded its upper body, leaving only the thick and tough octopus-like tentacles on its lower body. Tomorrow's special is octopus soup. Say that the ingredients are the violent octopus imported from the material plane. The price of each soup will be increased by 5 calamity coins. Say that it's because of the import tax. Reynolds' constantly transforming body had an extra mouth, and he loudly announced to the trembling staff in the kitchen. Chapter 9, 79. Reynold decided to be frank with him. After killing a servant demon and using its corpse as the ingredient for tomorrow's special meal, the demon count felt much more stable. He wriggled his jelly-like body and walked out of the kitchen. "Good day, my lord," he said. Facing the owner of Maladomini, even if he was unhappy, Reynolds still maintained a considerable amount of respect. "You've finally come out of the 9 hells. I thought that the suggestion book on every table in my Tanner fast food restaurant was just a decoration." The 7th Lord Barzub turned his head to look at Reynolds. Reynolds' jelly-like appearance made him feel like he was looking into a mirror, although both of them denied this point in their hearts and thought that the other was uglier. Slugs and sludge monsters were still somewhat similar. This was undeniable. "Sorry." Reynolds was the first to admit defeat in the face of questioning. "Today is the My Tanner fast food restaurant's film festival. We are providing free food for everyone today. The special meal you ordered is also the same." "You're not charging?" Barzub asked with a smile. After the 7th Lord finished speaking, 2 soul prisms suddenly appeared out of thin air. They fell on the table covered with a human skin tablecloth and collided with each other with a clang sound. "Yes," Reynolds immediately replied. The eyes on the soft-bodied demon's body only paused for a moment on the 2 pieces of lower realm hard currency. "Damn it, those are good stuff. At least 100 calamity coins." Then, it turned to another direction. It suddenly felt a little breathless. "You're lying. Even if you sent people to Loot Mountain Paradise, there will be no discounts in the My Tanner." Barzub joked. "When I buy something, I will never shortchange the seller. This is the rule." "But you're giving too much. Is the extra part the service fee?" Reynolds asked cautiously. Even if he was a great demon with wealth comparable to that of a country, he was still a little shaken by the additional income of dozens of calamity coins. The 7th suzerain ignored him and laughed out loud. Along with the laughter, hundreds of millions of flying insects flew out of his mouth and engulfed the entire McDonald's Tanner fast food restaurant in an instant. The travelers who were eating, the servants who worked in the kitchen and the front desk, and Reynolds' clone were all covered by the flying insects. "Of course not. I'm rich, but I'm not stupid." Barzub brought a napkin for himself, picked up the knife and fork with his 2 stubby arms, and began to enjoy his lunch. There was a piece of dark red jelly on top of the smelly steak burger in front of him. This powerful Lord Bothor slowly finished all the food he had ordered. After he left, the 2 sulfur mountains beside the McTagney fast food restaurant abruptly burst into flames. Due to insect infestation, the steel suspension bridge at the top of the mountain suddenly broke and fell straight down. The fast food restaurant building between the 2 mountains was smashed into ruins. Between the broken walls, there were no longer any living beings. Only 2 soul prisms were buried deep inside. Vader's 2nd floor, damn it. Standing at the top of a fake cliff made of steel, Reynolds cursed in his heart. However, due to the existence beside him, he didn't dare to say it out loud. "One of your perfect incarnations was eaten." Despat, who was wearing noble attire but holding a steel staff that didn't match his attire, softly asked his vassal. His tone was rather calm. Reynolds' slime-like body started to churn in an instant. Due to his anger, his body produced an extremely high temperature, and some gas spewed out from within. "That slug lord, he's a lunatic. He's like a bastard with a brain full of nonsense. He doesn't have any of the qualities a devil should have." The devil count spat at Barzub for a full 7 to 8 minutes. The 2nd suzerain and the 7th suzerain were like fire and water. It was no secret that they both wanted to get rid of each other. Thus, Reynolds didn't suspect that the other party would pass this message to Barzub. "Are you done talking?" Despat patiently listened to Reynolds' complaints before asking, "Can you do me a favor? I won't pay you. However, I can bestow this steel cliff to you. Use it as a place to open a new shop." "Your Majesty, may I ask?" Without waiting for Reynolds to ask, Despat's staff struck the devil count's body. He didn't use much strength, but the effect was shocking. As a lone devil, Reynolds wouldn't find it too tiring to deal with a pincer attack from 2 pit fiends. However, in the face of a proper Lord Bar, though, he had no chance to retaliate at all. just like how he had encountered Balzeb previously. Reynolds' body immediately turned into steel. His perfect incarnation turned from a slime into a rather strange steel sculpture. The base of this sculpture was the steel cliff beneath his feet. The greater devil's incarnation didn't die. He was only immobile, his consciousness imprisoned within the sculpture. Dispat looked at his work and nodded in satisfaction. Then, he continued to chant the incantation. The second Lord incantation was so obscure that even with Reynolds' knowledge, he could only make out a limited number of words. Forced exile from another world, forced steel of fate, reverse Elam's life substitution. Even so, Reynolds had a rough idea of Dispat's plan. He also understood why the second Lord had bestowed upon him a perfect incarnation when he'd been conferred the title of Devil Count. It was all in preparation for this day. At that time, the paying the bill operation had yet to take place. Despat and Barzab were still allies. For 2 whole days, Dispat's mouth hadn't stopped chanting. In order to activate this complicated spell trap that was partially based on Cassus's investiture of the gods, the second Lord had gone all out. It was precisely because of this that this spell was powerful enough to expel gods, or quasi-gods, from a specific plane. He's standing at the edge of the cliff. After the spell was cast, Depard apologetically patted the shoulder of the vassal who was about to stand on the edge of the cliff forever. Perhaps he wanted to comfort Reynolds. Regardless of whether the spell succeeded or not, a part of the demon count's consciousness would forever be imprisoned in his perfect, tempered avatar. You have a new shop as well. It's a win-win situation. Chapter 980. Grinder did not have the grace and agility of a drow warrior. In fact, their dance of death left a deep impression on the dwarf. In particular, the wounds on his body had deepened his impression of him. However, what the yellow-bearded dwarf lacked in grace, he made up for in violence. He rushed past a drow that he had cut down and met the charge head-on. After withstanding the impact of the scimitar, he pressed his legs against the ground and remained motionless. At this time, a rare dark elf with a shield rushed to the dwarf's side and used shield bash. Grinder vigorously chopped at the hand holding the shield. His axe split the shield open and even dug into the arm holding the shield. He immediately pulled out his weapon, causing the drow to fall in pain and have to regain his balance. Then, the dwarf attacked again. This time, the axe went through the shield and hit the drow's stomach. Because of the loss of magic, the drow noble warrior's armor could not provide complete protection. The injured creature staggered back, but a longsword suddenly pierced his back. "Damn it, magic area," Jarlaxle muttered. He pulled out the lifesteal sword. The tip of the long sword was still dripping with blood. This was impossible when magic was still attached to it. The battle had reached its climax. In fact, when magic lost its effect, this battle with a huge disparity in numbers became very casual. There were no blazing fireballs, no dazzling lightning. There were only slashes and slashes, punches and kicks, and dodging left and right. Even Keys was no exception. After the wailing short musket and the electromagnetic assault rifle ran out of bullets, he could not open his spatial equipment, so he could only pick up the Dragonhead Warhammer and engage in close combat with the enemy. The first to be targeted was the molten wax goblins. This kind of slimy monster, whether it was the other members of the adventure team or the 2 bats the devil summoned by him, was actually very difficult to deal with when they temporarily lost their ability to cast spells. The molten wax goblins were not afraid of slashing or piercing. Even if they were hit hard, the damage they received was very limited. Keys always used hammer to repel them and then added a white phosphorus incendiary bomb. This was very effective. Furthermore, there weren't as many wax demons as there were other types of enemies. Therefore, when the wax demons turned into real candles, they began to learn how to avoid battle. Among them, Starrick was the most conspicuous. This melted wax demon, who was the leader of the Earth Goblin Blasphemy Priests, retreated to the back of the army. "Charge!" Although he was retreating, Starrick ordered the Tauren and Drow to charge forward. "Take that guy's head, and I'll reward you. You will obtain great power." "Cunning bastard," After losing the ability to use magic, the Queen of Spiders, Lavis, also hid behind the army. She heard Stalik's ear-piercing roar and gave a rather pertinent evaluation. However, the number of people who were sober was always the minority. The Dark Elves were slightly better. As for the Taurens who couldn't think straight, they actually believed Starrick's promise and challenged Quest together. These 10 feet tall, strong monsters held axes and spears as they charged forward. Be careful of those bulls. The halfling Calder saw this scene from afar and hurriedly warned Keys loudly. He also threw a few smoke bombs in front of him that didn't require magic. However, because the distance was too far, this was all he could do. Even if he wanted to provide more help, this great trap maker couldn't do it. But this was enough for Keys. In fact, even without the help of these smoke bombs, the young blue dragon in human form wouldn't be afraid to fight the Taurens. It must be known that in addition to the unreasonable Megalosaurus, the natural top magical creature, and the powerful psychic ability user, Keys was also a master of 9 swords. Ironheart style, Steel Whirlwind. He suddenly jumped into the air, drawing a distorted afterimage as he fell into the range of the smoke bombs like a comet. He swept several Taurens with his dragon head. While he jumped back to the ground while maintaining his battle posture, the monsters were already lying on the ground. After Keys, he finished his move. The momentum of the Taurens' attack immediately came to an end. Their charge was interrupted, and the power of this wave of attack was immediately weakened by at least half. Then, he assumed a new posture and used another unique skill of the Ironheart style, Manticore Whirlwind, on a Tauren that was just about to come out of the smoke. This was a kind of giving someone a taste of their own medicine attack. The dragon head hammer hit the axe in the Tauren's hand like lightning and directed it to a completely different target. The Tauren could no longer control the weapon in his hand and could only swing it at another Tauren that was lucky enough to rush out of the smoke. A long-horned head flew high, and blood spurted out from the neck splashed on the Tauren's face. His eyes were covered by blood, and he was slightly absent-minded. In the next second, the dragon head hammer heavily smashed on his head. Death has come. The smell of blood is driving me crazy. In the passage to the House of Gold, inside the soul-binding tower, an army composed of earth goblins and bugbears was moving quickly. Most of these guys were only equipped with simple equipment, a non-standard weapon for killing in one hand, and a simple shield made of broken wooden planks in the other. However, the surface of their bodies was covered with scars, one after another, one after another. These scars piled up together as if they were wearing leather armor made of cuticles. They were the berserkers of the goblin-like race, the scarred warriors. At this moment, after receiving the oracle of the powerful true God that they believed in, they spontaneously gathered together and rushed into the soul-binding tower. To the glory of our God, to please our God, to offer a sacrifice to him, the scarred warriors roared. They wanted to kill all the lives that were still in the House of Gold at this moment. Whether it was the adventurers who sneaked in, or the drows and blasphemous priests who fought with the adventurers before. Just now, outside the soul-binding tower, some earth goblins and drows dared to stop them. Without saying a word, these scarred warriors swarmed forward and annihilated him. Because they created an area of dead magic, communication spells could not be used, so those Starrick did not know that blood was flowing in the drow city outside. And the instigators were his own kind. Chapter 981. Open up all those holes. Among the scarred warriors, a burly bugbear roared. He stepped on a collapsed iron wall and hopped around as he ordered his subordinates to open up the patios in the passage. Sunlight shone directly into the ground from the ground. He was wearing a set of armor made up of layers of armor, and between the gaps of the armor, there would be fluorescent light flashing from time to time. Just like the previous Zhuoweiqi, this bugbear had also fused with the broken armor. In addition to him, there were more than a dozen such monsters in this army of scarred warriors. They were the leaders of this army. After opening the patios and setting up the blazing sun crystal mirror, the seemingly scattered army actually maintained a considerable amount of order. The warm sunlight of the eternal blaze filled the passage and shone all the way into the House of Gold, along with the army. To the dark elves, the light of the eternal blaze was like a curse. Even if the light shone in from behind, they still felt deeply uncomfortable. Needless to say, as the light shone in, the screaming scarred warriors actually launched an attack on them. What's going on? Seeing the wandering Drow clan suddenly being attacked by their own people, Lavis immediately rushed to Slatak's side. The Spider Queen clutched a precious Ion stone in her hand tightly. Although almost all enchanted items could not be used in the area of death magic, items like the Dragon Head Warhammer in Keys's hand or the Ion Stone, which was created by the great Arcanist of Netheril, could still be used. At worst, they would die together. Slatak read Lavis's thoughts from her eyes. However, she had obviously misunderstood him now. The leader of the blasphemous priests could swear that he had never ordered the scarred warriors to rush in and start a massacre. Yes. Slatak suddenly thought of a possibility, which was the only reason why his close relatives would go crazy. It's the seventh Lord, Barzub, who is behind this. That great devil also has believers among the bugbears and earth goblins. In fact, there were still some things that he did not say. There was also a cooperative relationship between Sterek and Barzub. The spirit binding tower was built with the support of Lord Barzub. While he was considering whether or not to put the dead magic gem hidden in his body back into the magic sealing casket, the scarred warriors, who rushed him like a flood, had already followed the path formed by the sunlight and rushed straight to the center of the House of Gold, right below the perfect soul prism. Because they were caught off guard and neither side used magic, they not only killed many drows and taurens with the momentum of their charge, but they also quickly pushed down the Lamia devils summoned by Kays at the cost of their lives. Thanks to their ability to absorb energy from eternal blaze, the Sundering Moon warriors were incredibly strong. With only a dozen or so of them, they were able to drag the great devil several dozen meters away. For our god, the Sundering Moon warriors roared once more and slashed at Nemuku with their weapons. Even though the snake-scorpion demon beast was a high-ranked Batsu with thick skin and flesh, its body quickly became a bloody mess when it couldn't use any magic to defend itself against the frenzied attacks. In the end, one of the Sundering Moon warriors landed a final blow and completely severed its neck. Thick, dark green blood seeped out of the Lamia demon's body, and its body quickly shriveled up like a deflated balloon. Not long after, this great devil that had died in the material plane would be summoned back to the 9 prisons of Bader. However, the area of dead magic interfered with this process. Although the power of the 9 prisons of Bader still affected this area, the dissipation of the great devil's body became incomparably slow. Not only that, but the perfect soul prism that had been floating quietly all this time seemed to be guided by the power and instantly understood the path it had to take. It began to tremble, and with the help of the souls of the dead that it had absorbed, wave after wave of pure magic power began to surge out of this perfect soul prism. Like a tide, the power of magic washed away everything that it could touch, and it used this to perceive the surrounding situation. A powerful magic creature. No, defeating it was too difficult for it now. A strange creature with an internal circulation system that even had perception and wisdom. The Forerunner made it feel jealous, but it was still difficult to defeat it until the core of the soul-bound tower, the magical life, created by using part of the creation principle of Clinthiniban, and a magical creation carved out of the perfect soul prism, felt the thing that made it feel uncomfortable before the dead magic gem that was hidden in the body of the chief priest of the blasphemy priests finally reacted. It opened its eyes. The directional pulse of energy shot straight at Sterek, and he was hit before he could even react. More than half of the wax demon's body was washed away, and the remaining body was like mud that was thrown away. With a whoosh, it was pushed to the wall covered in gold foil. In an instant, the dead magic gem hidden in its body was exposed to the air. "No!" Sterek shouted. In the next second, the magic eye shot out a pulse and destroyed the gem. The purple-gray gem was like a burning coal, and it quickly emitted a blazing red light, and then it quickly burned into ashes. The dead magic area was immediately removed. Sacrifice. Begin our sacrifice. Seeing this scene, the bugbears and earth goblins immediately gave the new order to the scarred warriors around them. They became even crazier and brandished their weapons at the drow of their former allies without any explanation. Blood and death were the most pleasing offerings for the god. Whether it was theirs or the enemy's, it would do. Not only that, but the sunlight that shone in from the entrance of the golden house suddenly became much more intense. Not to mention the drows, even the dwarves and halflings that could live on the surface of the earth felt uncomfortable. The eternal blaze that symbolized life and warmth in the past seemed to have turned into a poisonous fireball at this moment, just as the dark elves said. "We can't let those guys die." Keys immediately realized the key to the problem. The dead magic area had disappeared, and the core of the soul-binding tower had basically completed its awakening, so he did not need to worry about using spells. Following its master's will, the dragon head warhammer immediately transformed into a flaming chain. It was like a long snake floating in the air as it slithered around the House of Gold, wrapping up the frenzy-eating soldiers one by one like dumplings. Keys had already seen that these guys were about to sacrifice themselves. Even if the situation was unclear, they could not let the enemy carry out the plan smoothly. But Chapter 982. As the existence at the top of the pyramid of the Batsu devil family, each of the lords of Batsu had chosen their own path. They had practiced the path of order in different ways. Astamos was the noblest of them all, and he was also the most astute of them all. He had set up an unreproachable goal as a guide for himself. Dispar had once been Astamos' assistant, and he had learned from that old officer, using class and rule to govern his own plane. Man was focused on benefits, but it was precisely because of this that he always got himself into trouble. Bayer was a newly promoted feudal lord, and he had no choice but to rely on the discipline taught by his big boss to restrain his subordinates. As for Barzub, the lord of the flying insects of Maladomini, perhaps out of a compulsion for perfection or out of paranoia, he preferred reconstruction. He devoted his life to correcting the phenomenon of entropy increase. Although it seemed to be a little strenuous and unrewarding, it was still a good medicine to squander the demon's long life. Moreover, in theory, the phenomenon of entropy increase brought about by chaos would not disappear, so Barzub's pursuit was also endless. The strange hobby of always trying to overthrow something and then rebuild it was also a powerful path of order. However, mortals usually could not understand his behavior. Even his most worshippers were no exception. In the Ashen world, in the House of Gold of the soul-binding tower, the army composed of bugbears and scar-faced earth goblins had almost fallen into madness. In order to glory and please the object of their worship, these guys had killed until their eyes were red. They treated the enemies in front of them, their former allies, and even themselves as sacrifices. This kind of fanaticism was so high that even Keys himself, no matter if he used his psionic power or group-type enchantment spells, were all ineffective against them. The young blue dragon in human form could only awkwardly knock them out. This was very difficult, even many times more difficult than directly killing them all. Moreover, in order to prevent them from completing the sacrifice, Keys really could not directly crush these guys. For our god, those scarred warriors who had been brainwashed, even though their bodies were bound, still tried to bite their tongues or even hold their breaths to commit suicide. Thump, thump, thump. Just like a game of whack-a-mole, Hammer kept hammering. Just as Keys personally took control of the situation, the magical items on his body recovered their effects, and the strength of Jarlaxle, the leader of the Dayad Independent Mercenary Group, also returned. With the help of Phantom Cloak and Displacement Boots, the Dark Elf mercenary leader directly passed through the group of wandering drow soldiers and rushed to Sterrick, who was blown away by the magic eye and embedded in the wall. "Do you want to live or die?" It was clearly a question, but his tone was firm. Jarlaxle did not believe that the leader of the blasphemous priests was willing to die. At the same time, he used life steal and bloodlight to cut off one of the tentacles. This didn't take much effort at all. If Stalik wasn't at the end of his rope, then he was releasing his goodwill. He made his decision. Make that evil eye close. Jarlaxle ordered. Don't tell me you didn't prepare any countermeasures when you built this spell tower. While Jarlaxle and Sterek were talking, the Spider Queen Lady Lavis had taken over the command of the wandering Drow clan army. This powerful female warlock and warrior used words to intimidate the soldiers who wanted to kill the goblin-scarred warrior. All of you stop. Not only that, when the death magic area was lifted, she immediately took out a Slaw Toad gem and summoned her personal guards. Under the leadership of 3 Slaw Toad curse wizards, a total of 13 Slaw Blue Toads appeared in the House of Gold. Those Magic Claw Blue Toads were all as strong as a Tauren. They constantly rubbed the 3 sharp thorns protruding from their palms, making a chi-chi-chi-chi sound. As soon as the 3-headed Slaw Green Toad appeared, it slammed its cane on the ground, and then hid in the dark. Lavis gave Jarlaxle a death stare. Although she wanted to order the Slaw Toad guards to kill this damn dark elf mercenary leader who had killed her once, for the sake of the overall situation, everything that happened here was too strange. Lavis had to put her personal grudges aside for the time being. Watch over all the Drow. Don't let them kill as they please. Lavis ordered the Slaw Toad curse wizards through the Slaw Toad gem in her hand. Struggling and twisting, Sterek turned from a wax demon into a blasphemous priest. He quickly took the clothes from a Drow servant and hurriedly put them on. Then he began to rummage through the bags on the clothes. In the end, he found a small candle that was shining with a green fluorescent light. Damn you, Lord of the Flying Insects. You're the one who broke the contract first. Don't blame me. Just as the blasphemous priest reached out his finger to the wick of the candle, a pulse shot out from the magic eye and hit the spot where he was standing. Jarlaxle and Sterek both moved to the side and dodged this spell that was very similar in nature to the Finger of Death. However, the Drow servant who took the clothes for Sterek was one step too slow. When the magic pulse hit her directly, her dark gray skin immediately revealed an indescribable pale white color. It was as if her blood was instantly drained and her soul was directly shattered. In short, this unlucky dark elf collapsed to the ground and couldn't be more dead. Damn bastard, Sterek cursed. He didn't get up from the ground. Instead, he twisted the wick of the green fluorescent candle with his finger. The flames suddenly sprang up, followed by a cloud of green smoke. The smoke was so thick that it didn't seem like it came from a small candle. Instead, it was more like the kind that rose from a bonfire. The smoke turned into a giant net and shrouded the magic eye that was suspended in the center of the House of Gold. As for the golden threads that were connected to the magic eye, they would immediately snap when they came into contact with the smoke. No, you don't want to do this. A voice suddenly sounded in Sterek's mind, but the blasphemous priest didn't move at all. Instead, he replied in a very disgusted tone, "Get out of my mind. Get out of my mind. You fake life, you devil's creation. You'll regret it. You'll all regret it." As the smoke gradually approached, the red light of the magic eye flashed faster and faster. It was as if the timer on a time bomb had reached the last second. Chapter 983. The plan is going well. Barzab stretched out his 2 stubby palms and stroked a divination mirror that was shining with a pale blue light. With the help of this treasure, the 7th Lord was able to observe what was happening in the Ashes Bit Wall and predict the outcome in advance. Since the Astamores had transformed him into a despicable slug, Barzab rarely stood in front of the mirror. He was worried that he would be angry when he saw himself in the mirror and then destroy the treasure. However, today was an exception. The meaning of remodeling is to create order, but the fun is in the subversion before the creation. The 7th Overlord opened its huge mouth, and countless flying insects gushed out like a swarm of bees toward the magic mirror in front of it. When they touched the mirror, it was as if they had passed through a barrier made of water. As if they were wrapped in sticky liquid, these flying insects sneaked out of Maladomini, the 7th floor of the 9 prisons of Bader, and embarked on the journey to the Ashes world. When the last flying insect rushed into the mirror, Barzub's shriveled body instantly collapsed to the ground. The mucus that kept flowing on his skin quickly turned into a highly corrosive liquid and digested his avatar that had been used for a long time. The perfect avatar creation method that he had obtained from Reynold was now put to use. After the payment, although Barzub was not imprisoned, he was secretly forbidden by the Lord of Nine Hells to create avatars in the material plane. With the help of the secret spell of Reynold, the demon earl who had opened fast food restaurants all over the 9 prisons of Bader, he had successfully broken the shackles. But just as this avatar disappeared, a violent earthquake suddenly occurred in the strange countryside of Maladomini, which was scorched earth and lava, with swamps and mountains coexisting. The earth cracked for no reason, and a stream of blood-like viscous liquid suddenly burst out of the ground like a fountain. All the residents living on the 7th floor of Bader felt a great fear. "Despat you! You bastard, I'll curse you!" A violent roar rang out from the core of Maladomini. The volume of the roar was so loud that not only did it fill the ears of the inhabitants of the plane, but it even penetrated the 6th, 5th, and 4th layers of the 9 hells, until it reached the steel city of Dis. Powerful and invisible magic power formed invisible chains that penetrated into the ground of Maladomini. They penetrated the body of a behemoth hidden deep in the core of this plane. It was a monster whose lower body was like a slug, but whose upper body was like an angel that had been magnified countless times. They bound Barzub's real body tightly. These chains were all connected to the divination mirror in front of Barzub's dissipated avatar. The 7th Lord's act of transferring his avatar to the material plane was like opening the hatch of a moving plane, causing a strong negative pressure, and his real body, hidden deep in the ground of Maladomini, was like the cargo or passenger of the plane. Under the negative pressure, he was constantly being pulled into the Ashen world, where the pressure was lower and was being expelled in a disguised form. If this expulsion really succeeded, the result would undoubtedly be extremely terrible, no matter how long Barzub's real body stayed in that world, even if it was only for a second. Because the connection with the 7th floor of Bader was temporarily cut off, his lord status would be dismissed for a second. Without the lord status, the Master of 9 Hells would have an excuse to kill him. Even if Astur Morse wouldn't make a move for some reason, it wasn't as if Balzeb didn't have any other enemies in Bartholomew. The 8th Lord, Mephisto, and the 2nd Lord, Despat, all had good reasons to behead him, who had temporarily lost his power. Therefore, Barzub's real body was constantly resisting this pull. However, the power of the spell cast on him was so great. As a result, not only did the real body of the winged insect lord suffer a lot of injuries, but its blood turned into a fountain and gushed out crazily. All the masters in the 9 hells who suddenly understood what had happened turned their gazes in this direction. The various generals of Batsu, the powerful 8 dark demon generals, the group of evil gods living in seclusion in the 9 prisons of Bader, the lords, and their vassals of the other planes of Bader. All of them were observing Barzub. Of course, they were only watching now. Although these guys all had the idea of adding insult to injury, no one took the initiative to act. After all, Barzub was not a pushover. However, this strange stalemate was finally broken by a figure that suddenly appeared in Maladomini. It was a tall devil dressed in gorgeous aristocratic clothes. He had 2 small sharp horns on his head and a powerful magic staff inlaid with a ruby at the top. At the same time he appeared, the eyes of those powerful evil devils who had been watching from the sidelines lit up. "My marshal." Astamor's avatar nodded and looked at the huge canyon that had appeared in Maladomini. He looked at the giant beast that was constantly being tied up underground. "This is your calamity. You can't just avoid it. Moreover, your struggle has not only affected the plane of Maladomini, but even my Nessus is now shaking." So, the Master of 9 Hells raised his ruby scepter high and pointed it at the huge canyon that had cracked open on the ground. A new magic chain suddenly sprang out and also hit Barzub's real body. "I came here to invite you to come with me. Take it as a trip to another plane to relax. Whether you can return or not, it's up to you." As soon as he finished speaking, the stalemate was instantly broken. Balzeb's true body seemed to have been pulled out by a spring that had been stretched to its limit. He quickly rose from the bottom of the canyon and followed the trajectory of the chains, quickly being dragged towards the palace where he had placed the divination mirror. "Don't worry, I won't do anything to you," Astamor said sincerely as he looked at Barzub, who had turned into an even more terrifying sea of insects and was being dragged into the passage that connected to the Ashes world. "And I've stipulated that your exile will only last for 2 days. At dawn on the 3rd day, I will announce the ownership of the position of the 7th Lord to the 9 Hells." The last sentence of the Master of 9 Hells spread through the 9 Hells of Bader in an instant. However, those who really heard it were actually the top devils who were qualified to see Barzub's real body change. They were either evil gods or unique devils. Even the powerful pit fiends were not qualified to hear this message. In other words, these guys were also qualified to take a step forward. Chapter 984. As mentioned before, the path of order that Astamors had chosen for himself was called purpose. This Master of 9 Hells was Batsu, the most purposeful of them all. His every action and every word he said was not without purpose. However, almost no one could keep up with his train of thought. The moment Barzub's real body was sent away, the 7th level of Bader had lost the suppression of a Batsu Lord. First, there was a large-scale riot in the cities built by the Wing Bug Lord. In order to fight for power, the middle and high-level Batsu Devil began to attack each other. In less than an hour, the beautiful and majestic cities were turned into ruins and scorched earth. Following closely behind them were the evil gods who had been living in seclusion. They also began to expand their god's kingdom without any scruples. They tried their best to put all the territories that were temporarily ownerless into their own hands. Inevitably, there was a war between them and other Batsu Devil. In addition, the powerful indigenous races that had lived here before the demons occupied Bader also began to riot. Monsters that even the most knowledgeable scholars in the multiverse might not be able to recognize appeared on the earth, in the sky, in the swamps, in the mountains, and in the sea. They appeared in various places of Maladomini and began to take revenge on the demons. However, the more terrifying scene could only be seen from a more macroscopic perspective. Maladomini had lost the powerful real body of Barzub as its cornerstone, so it had become not strong enough. At this time, the 7th level of 9 Hells was being squeezed by the 6th and 8th levels. The edge of this plane had collapsed, and some places even slipped directly to the neighboring planes. Fortunately, the incarnation of Astamors had not left. More accurately, although the strongest Batsu Devil had hidden his tracks and expressed to all the existences in Maladomini that he had no intention of getting involved in the dispute, he had left the ruby scepter that symbolized the authority of the Master of 9 Hells in place. When Barzub was expelled, the divine weapon, which was said to be able to kill greater gods, immediately pierced through the whole of Maladomini and connected to Malbolge and Cania. It used its own power to temporarily pin down this plane so that it would not collapse into the void of the astral plane. As the Master of the 9 Hells, the Astamors had the responsibility to ensure the integrity of the 9 Hells. Otherwise, the 9 prisons of Bader could no longer be called the 9 Hells if they lost a level. The title of Master of the 9 Hells would no longer be deserved. However, this was not an easy task. Moreover, although Astamors had many avatars, no one knew the exact number. He himself had thousands of avatars every day, and he needed all of them to think and execute countless schemes at every moment. Therefore, he could not devote an avatar to stabilizing Maladomini indefinitely. Therefore, he had set a date. 3 days was the maximum time that Astamors could leave this avatar in this plane. It was also the exact number that he had divined for Barzub, the most troublesome test that could hinder the return of the Lord of the Flying Insects. Moreover, even if that guy could withstand these 3 tests and return to Maladomini, his original body would definitely be seriously injured. At that time, Astamors could slightly relax his monitoring of this dissident and free up his hands to do other things. This would be enough to make up for the loss of 3 days of leaving his avatar here. If Barzub unfortunately died in the world of ashes, Astamors would choose a pawn to replace him. For the Master of the Nine Hells, this was not the first time that he had done this. For specific examples, one could refer to the history of the first level's temporary lord, Bardi, the palace struggle of the 6th level's Malbolge, and the Two Kings replacement incident of the 5th level Stygia. Every time, Astamors had perfectly achieved his goal. Of course, these were all the calculations of the Master of the Nine Hells. It was the kind of thinking that really belonged to the 5th level. Unlike the readers who had the author's full explanation, the thinking of the people in the Nine Hells of Bader could not reach such a high level. In fact, there were not many demons who could understand the true meaning of 3 days. Moreover, even those who were lucky enough to guess a little bit of the true meaning of the Master of the Nine Hells were now confused. Or the 3 tests of Barzub. Because the world of ashes was a famous place in the multiverse that was hated by the gods, it was difficult for the gods to do anything there. Therefore, it should not be any gods who could target Barzub. As for the demons, who stood on the eternal opposite side of the demons, with the efficiency of the low-level races, the Batsu Devil's Chain of Contempt, it was estimated that they would not be able to kill a powerhouse like the Lord of the Flying Insects in 3 days. As for the Batsu, there were not many who could threaten Barzub. The Lord of the Flying Insects was a demigod. Theoretically, only the other Batsu lords and high-ranking demon nobles could, or were qualified to kill him. Moreover, this was only in theory. Astamors had always been a man of words. Excluding the Master of the Nine Hells, in terms of pure strength, only Mephisto and Prince Levesto could stand shoulder to shoulder with Barzub on the surface. The former had a grudge against Barzub and would most likely use this opportunity to send his incarnation to kill him. However, the latter was still being preserved in the glacier of Stygia in the form of frozen meat by Astamors. Therefore, he did not have the opportunity to kill the Lord of the Flying Insects. Therefore, it was reasonable to say that Barzub would only face one disaster. As for the demon nobles, although they were also qualified to kill Barzub, their strength did not allow them to do so. A few of the smarter ones, among the demons, the word smart, originally meant to be proficient in the way of wisdom, would think that Mephisto might pay some price to persuade the Iron Duke Despot, who was known for his shut-in nature, to go with them. However, even if Despot was included, Barzub could only speculate that there would be 2 disasters. What exactly was the 3rd tribulation? In the House of Gold, of the soul-binding tower and soul city in the world of ashes, looking at the perfect soul prism that seemed to be about to explode, Keyes decisively summoned a portal and asked the adventurer team to escape. Somehow, he had already felt something and knew that this magic I would definitely have an accident. His plan to explore the underground city and destroy the spirit-binding tower before it was completed had a 99% chance of failing. It seems that there are no tricks in this world. To forge iron, one must be strong. To solve the problem, in the end, I still have to use the power of the scales of eternal order and flatten this place fair and square. Chapter 985. Retreat. Starrick roared. Immediately afterward, the leader of the blasphemy priests turned into a cloud of yellow-green smoke and fled through the passage connecting to the House of Gold toward the city of Drow outside. The other Drow, led by the Spider Queen Lady Lavis, also reacted quickly and tried to find a way to break out. In the core control room of the soul-binding tower, the large space soon became empty, leaving only a pile of corpses and the scarred warrior who was knocked unconscious by Keyes with a dragon head warhammer. At this moment, the confrontation between the perfect soul prism suspended in the middle of the House of Gold and the smoke summoned by Starrick's magic candle finally reached a critical point. Cracks began to appear. On such a magic eye, thousands of cracks appeared in an instant. The surging magic energy turned into a thick amber-colored liquid that flowed out of the core of the soul-binding tower and dripped to the ground. Like a meandering centipede, this viscous liquid slowly meandered on the ground. It passed through the corpses of the dark elves and torrents, passed through the unconscious earth goblins and bugbears, passed through the corpses of the demons and devils that had begun to decay. Everything that was touched by it was quickly assimilated into pure magic energy, turning into something like a faded old photo, and then melting into the thick liquid. Flames, lightning, storms, frost, vicious curses, tempting whispers. Under the influence of magic energy, all kinds of strange scenes began to appear in this house of gold. In the corner of the house of gold, a six-legged, gold-swallowing beast was shivering. When the leader of the blasphemy priests summoned the dead magic area, as a magic creature, this gold-swallowing beast named Cha-Cha abandoned its poop picker, the orc druid Marsh Fezzik, and escaped by itself. It used its sharp claws to tear the gold foil on the wall of the house of gold, trying to dig a hole that could accommodate itself. Originally, Cha-Cha had already dug out more than 10 yards, but the moment the dead magic area disappeared, the originally soft rock wall became harder than gold and stone. In the end, it had no choice but to return to the house of gold to find a way out. However, when Cha-Cha returned to the old haunt, it encountered the shattering of the perfect soul prism. The rich magic power had already melted into a viscous liquid, surrounding the metal-swallowing beast from all directions. Oh, the gold-swallowing beast let out a roar. And at this moment, a coincidence of coincidences appeared once again. The core of the soul-binding tower built by the perfect soul prism suddenly shattered completely, but an earth-shattering explosion didn't happen. In the blink of an eye, a flying insect appeared out of thin air from where the magic I was originally floating. Barzub, who was far away in the 9 prisons of Bader, used the perfect incarnation and forcibly seized the magic core that was about to give birth to wisdom. The great demon turned itself into the tower spirit of the soul-binding tower. Looking at some of the viscous liquid that was shrinking, the gold-swallowing beast felt a sense of relief. It immediately wanted to run to the opposite side of the house of gold to escape as soon as possible. However, just as it was about to reach the end of the passage with its 6 short legs, the gold-swallowing beast suddenly felt a great sense of horror. Its fur all stood up in an instant. Buzz, the flying insect suddenly filled the entire house of gold. The gold-swallowing beast that was about to escape did not succeed in the end. It was engulfed and assimilated by the flying insects, together with all the matter and space in the core of the soul-binding tower. It became a part of a powerful creature. The real body of the 7th Lord, Barzub, descended into this world. Astamor's Despat. Barzub, whose upper body was as huge as a giant and as handsome as a heavenly creature, but his lower body was just an ugly slug. He roared angrily in the depths of his heart. His resentment was so strong that in the blink of an eye, not only did it completely cover the soul-binding tower, but it also affected the entire Tsok city. The members of the wandering Tsok clan who had not had time to retreat to the surface, as well as the slave races enslaved by the former, all fell into a state of shock in an instant. Some of them were even scared to death. However, it didn't take long for Barzub's resentment to disappear. This guy seemed to have lost his mind and began to laugh wildly. However, the demonic laughter was still terrifying to mortals. Another batch of unlucky fellows. Although they managed to survive the wrath of the archdevil, they still couldn't escape today's calamity and died one after another. After a full 1/3 of an hourglass, Barzub's real body really condensed in the ash world, and the entire Tsok city was about to completely become a dead city. The 7th Lord stretched out his hands and forcefully opened the soul-binding tower that restrained his body. Because when he first performed the perfect incarnation technique, his replacement target was the perfect soul prism that was about to give birth to a complete self-consciousness, which was the tower spirit of the soul-binding tower. So when his real body descended, he still occupied the previous target. In other words, Barzub's real body could not move at will, and his slug-like lower body grew in the ruins of the soul-binding tower. Damn it! Barzub moved his body angrily, but the soul-binding tower gave him the ability to absorb the soul power of the ash world, and at the same time, It was equivalent to establishing a contract with this world. So he quickly judged that if he didn't pay a certain price, he really couldn't leave the soul-binding tower and move freely. However, when he was exiled from the 9 prisons of Bader by the Astamors, Barzub also heard the prophecy of the Master of 9 Hells. With his wisdom, he naturally understood the deep meaning of the words of the Master of 9 Hells. In these 3 days, there would be a series of demons who were eager to go further to crusade against him. And among them, there were 3 extremely troublesome guys who were very likely to be killed in the material plane. Therefore, Barzub couldn't act according to his own thoughts for the time being. He had to use his power carefully for the time being. At the very least, he had to be careful now. In that case, Barzub stretched his body, and his 2 palms touched the sky of Tsoke City. Countless flying insects instantly covered the fluorescent rocks and began to gnaw on them. Chapter 986. Ashen World, Archipelago Province, Main Island City. The atmosphere here was completely different from the other cities taken over by the scale of perpetual order. The stench was filled with the smell of despair. Does despair have a smell? Keyes felt that it could be described. The dark road was filled with a mixture of smells, both sweat and cheap alcohol. Uncleaned stains stuck to the street, sending out a nauseating stench and other indescribable smells. In other cities under the jurisdiction of the Chamber of Commerce, pedestrians usually traveled in groups, and only occasionally there was a curfew to be observed. The streets in those places were filled with the smell of spices and industrial products. There was the smell of new leather and sometimes the smell of some livestock. The barracks there were filled with the smell of polish and oil. Every soldier had something to do. Although there weren't many of them, everyone maintained their military discipline. Their uniforms were like shields to prevent any possible chaos. In the main island city, the pedestrians here were usually running around in groups, like a nest of headless flies running around randomly. Even if the army of the main island city wore uniforms, the standard of the Medici Empire, most of their jackets were not buttoned up and their pants were wrinkled. These soldiers were previously under the leadership of the Zagan family, and this leader was obviously not as serious and responsible as the generals in the scale of perpetual order, and his ability was much worse. These people are trash. Contract Mana had always been in charge of foreign affairs, and the handover of the main island city was no exception. What's worse is that we have to be responsible for cleaning them up. Quick and steady. Quest walked past Numun. The young blue dragon in human form walked step by step towards the several dozen meters tall stone gate outside the Zagan family's residence. As he passed through, the door collapsed with a loud bang, turning into a pile of rubble. The house of the first family in the Archipelago province, which had been passed down for more than 300 years, also collapsed with his footsteps. Fortunately, half an hourglass ago, everyone in the house had been evacuated. They were sent to the dock of the main island city, boarded the fleet sent by the scale of perpetual order, and quickly left the island. Now, not only the transport ships and Leviathan airships sent by the Chamber of Commerce, but also the merchant ships and pirate ships that were originally docked at the dock of the main island city were all requisitioned by the scale of perpetual order. In the next 3 hourglasses, all the residents in the city would be transported to the land closest to the main island city, which was originally the territory of the Zagan family's rival, the Khalil family. In addition, in the waters around the main island city, young or newly matured blue dragon were constantly flying. They obeyed the orders of the current patriarch Keyes and followed the steampunk half-lich Snade to visit the intelligent creatures living in the sea. Whether it was the Sawajan, the Loka, the mermaid clans, or the sea magic creatures that lived alone, they all received the friendly persuasion from the scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce. They were ordered to immediately migrate to the southern seas to lie low for the time being. If they accepted the persuasion, the Chamber of Commerce would send them a generous compensation package, which would be enough to make up for the losses caused by their hasty migration. Otherwise, Snade would let the Megalosaurus act as free porters to drive away those who did not know what was good for them. Within 400 nautical miles around the main island city, not a single intelligent creature is allowed to live. This was a strict order set by Keys. The reason why he did this was actually for the sake of those intelligent creatures. After all, Barzab had come to the world of ashes. After taking over the tower spirit of the soul-binding tower, he could figure out what the Lord of Hell wanted to do with the tip of his tail. In addition to the soul-binding tower built by the wandering drows, there were currently a total of 3 such magic towers in the world of ashes. The souls born after the death of intelligent creatures would be automatically attracted to them. What Keys wanted to do was to destroy the Lord of Hell. Since he was going to keep the Lord of Hell, who coveted the world of ashes, he could not give him a chance to replenish his power. However, even though the young blue dragon's decision was quite timely, Barzab's action was not slow. Just as the last batch of residents in the main island city sailed out to sea, a terrifying living magic tower grew out of the sea. The Lord of Balzeb opened the dome of Diziel in city. After destroying the city and reaping the lives of the wandering drow and their slaves who had yet to leave, Balzeb's huge body floated to the surface of the sea. The moment he emerged from the sea, this powerful demon summoned an endless swarm of insects and began a large-scale predatory activity with him as the center. Flying in the sky, swimming in the sea, running on land, as long as they were living creatures, they were all targets of the insects. Those pirates who had played tricks and secretly escaped to some small islands with the scale of perpetual order were the first to bear the brunt of the attack. Because they were intelligent creatures, their souls were now great nourishment for Barzab. In order to deal with the 3 disasters predicted by the Astamors, the Lord of the Flying Insects had to quickly restore himself to his peak state. The insects hissed and blood flowed. The swarm of insects in the sky and in the sea made the surrounding dozens of nautical miles blood red. If it wasn't for the half-lich Snader holding the fort, even the blue dragons that were chasing away the last wave of Sawajan would have suffered casualties. For the intelligent creatures living near the main island city, today was their doomsday, and Barzab was their butcher. That powerful, sinister devil was desperately thinking about their lives. Not enough, not enough, not enough. Because the response of the scale of perpetual order was quite fast, the Lord of the Flying Insects let out a furious roar when it sensed the scattered soul power that was far from what Barzab had expected. However, before he could command the swarm to hunt for food further away, the prophesied calamity followed. What was surprising was that the manifestation of this disaster did not come from the 2 enemy lords of the 9 prisons of Bader, Despat and Mephisto, nor from the massive army of Batsu. Instead, it was a monster-like, muscular bugbear goblin. It had huge fangs, strong body, and huge claws and feet. Its name was Hrughek. However, before it could command the swarm of insects to hunt further away, its first wave of disaster followed. The pursuers from the 9 prisons of Bader also followed. Chapter 987. Hrughek was the leading god of bear spirits, but he did not really rule over his members. None of the bear spirits actively opposed Hrughek's interests, and Hrughek also let them stay on their own. This god, who had the titles of Executioner and Master of Ambush, took pleasure in barbaric battles. However, he was not a true god of war and battle. Regardless of whether it was a group battle or an epic confrontation, none of them were what the Earth Spirit Bear god pursued. This was due to 2 reasons. First, the number of his people was not enough for him to be tainted with the priesthood of war and battle, and Hrughek would rather see his people use their own sneaky schemes to eliminate other creatures. Second, the bear spirits were an opportunistic race. Though Hrughek knew that his people would be happy to see elves, dwarves, goblins, gnomes, or anything else that could move, cut open, or better yet, cut off the head, Hrughek knew that his people would be happy to see elves, dwarves, goblins, gnomes, or anything else that could move. But this could not bring any benefits to the bear spirits. In fact, among all the goblin-like creatures, although the bear spirits were the strongest and most powerful, their population size was too small compared to the goblins and earth goblins. Therefore, in battle, The earth spirit bugbears would generally appear in the army of the other two cousins as mercenaries or slaves. They had no way of seizing command, not to mention the priority right to share the benefits after the battle. As a race god, although Hrughek was a chaotic god who lived in the noisy, empty tunnel, he still made a lot of efforts to change the awkward position of the bear spirits. For example, because the goblins and the bear spirits would compete for resources, he had more than once provoked the relationship between the main god of goblins, Supreme Chief Magnubir, the goblins, god of territory and cooperation, and the goblins, god of slavery, Kugobayag. Hrughek might not be particularly smart, but he was treacherous and cunning. Therefore, he did a good job. Another example would be Hrughek. Even though he had the potential to become a great divine power, he was still able to recognize his own situation. After the Plague of Law incident, he turned to the god of tyranny, Ban, for protection and became a follower of the latter. It was also because of this series of ingenious schemes that Hrughek gradually removed his title as a weak god and put on the crown of an intermediate god, becoming one of the more powerful ones in the pantheon. There were not many intermediate gods in the multiverse. However, Hrughek, who had always been very sensible and good at swallowing humiliation, also had a mortal enemy in his heart. It wasn't one of the other two gods of the earth spirit bugbears, but it was the seventh suzerain of the 9 prisons of Bader. Barzab, appearing in the ash world, his feet stepped on the surface of the sea as if he was standing on flat ground. Hrughek looked at the winged insect lord in the distance, whose body was like a giant, and let out a roar full of anger. There was a deep hatred between him and Barzab. In order to expand his influence in the material plane, the Lord of Maladomini, the 7th level of the 9 hells of Bator, had once chosen the bear and the gnomes, a race that worshipped power and treated anyone who had milk as their mother, and tempted them to believe in him. After learning of Barzab's misfortune, Hrughek's first reaction was to come to the ash world to add insult to injury. Stupid trash. Barzab caught a glimpse of the incarnation of the god of the earth spirit bugbears and gave a sincere comment. Even if the other party was an incarnation of an intermediate divine power, how much power could he exert in a place like the ash world, which was hated by the gods? Moreover, the reason why Hrughek could come here was presumably that the information he got was leaked by the ambitious people in the 9 prisons of Bader. In other words, he was being used as a tool, a mere pawn. Barzab did not take him seriously at all. The winged insect lord stretched his body and casually pointed in Hrughek's direction. Then, a meteorite fell from the sky and smashed toward the other party. As the most powerful Batsa devil, Barzab could freely use Meteor Burst, a powerful spell that even pit fiends could only use once a day. You despicable blasphemer! Seeing that the winged insect lord did not take him seriously, Hrughek did not hesitate to take out his beloved warhammer. He swung it up forcefully, and the spiked warhammer accurately hit the falling meteor, shattering it in the air. Broken pieces of rock and sputtering flames formed pillars of water on the surface of the sea. Steam suddenly rose into the air. However, the god of earth spirit bugbears had no intention of charging at Barzab to engage in a close-range battle. He chanted a long and complicated incantation, summoning the magical items that he had hidden in the clamorous void tunnel's lair. These were skulls that had undergone complicated processing and enchantment, the raw materials chosen from the enemies the god of the earth spirit bugbears had subdued. Trolls, giants, ogres, humans, orcs, dwarves, elves. Many of the skulls' owners had been tortured by an eternal curse. Their minds had been distorted, and they constantly prayed for mercy, praising the power of the god of the earth spirit bugbears. When Hrughek brought them to the prime material plane, these skulls had magical powers that could control the creatures of the race they belonged to. They were believed to have the magical powers of domination, group suggestion, and the ability to chant command. As the earth spirit bugbears were not known for being good at magic, the existence of these skulls hinted at a certain form of agreement between a god or someone with great magical powers, or someone with quasi-divine powers, and Hrughek, although no one knew the real content of this agreement. Listen to my orders." Krughek roared loudly, using his divine power to drive these arcane skulls to work. "Come to where I am, and crusade against the most despicable thief of all planes, Barzub." Logically speaking, if the incarnation of a mid-level divine power god used these magical items at full force, at least all the creatures within thousands of square kilometers would be affected. Even if they did not come immediately, they would immediately respond to Krughek's summons. Chapter 988. Only a few hundred intelligent monsters responded to the summons of the god of bugbears at the first moment. Compared to the divine power used to summon them, his input-output ratio was ridiculously high. "What's going on?" Krughek was speechless as he looked at the first batch of warriors that arrived at the battlefield. They were the salt marsh giants that lived in the lagoon around the main island. When the scale of Perpetual Order was carrying out the migration mission, these guys hid in the damp caves and did not come out. And at this moment, these monsters actually ran out to die, literally, at the first moment. Go and attack that despicable thief. Tear down the altar beneath him. Because there was no other choice, the god of the bugbears could only make do and gave the salt marsh giants an order from God. This roar, ho-ho, the salt marsh giants roared with unknown meaning. Their cold, gloomy eyes stared out from their fish-like faces. These fat, green-skinned giants with webbed fingers slapped the thick, slippery, seaweed-covered skin of their bellies with weapons they got from who knows where. Some were spears made of flint, some were wooden sticks inlaid with gravel, and some were even abandoned anchors. Slap, slap, slap. This was a ritual before the battle. Sometimes the salt marsh giants would mix with the terrifying monsters that emerged from the deep sea. They believed that these creatures were messengers sent by the god they believed in. This further led to the deterioration of their race, and the offspring of this evil combination would often have the bloodline of the deep sea monsters. After performing the corresponding ritual, the bodies of the salt marsh giants began to twist. Tentacles, scales, and other characteristics of aquatic creatures grew on their bodies. At the same time, their brains that were about the size of an apple lost their rationality. When the first salt marsh giant dove deep into the sea, his fellow salt marsh giants followed suit and quickly swam towards their target. Like a large toad, these monsters with webbed fingers and toes had ignored the indomitable body of Barzub. They regarded the Lord of Hell as their prey and were ready to start a hunt. However, even if these monsters were tied together, they would not be able to withstand one finger of Barzub's. And the Seventh Lord did not want to deal with these bastards at all. His upper body, which looked as if it had been carved by a knife, stretched out. With a light pinch of 2 fingers, a soul prism shining with a deep purple luster appeared at his fingertips. The color of this soul prism meant that it had recently been used to imprison a soul. Barzub gently threw it to the group of salt marsh giants that were swimming towards him. Then a spell shot from his fingertips and hit the soul prism that was thrown out. The soul inside turned into a cloud of smoke and was freed from the state of imprisonment. It was a human wearing a blue crown and a traditional Medici silk robe. He was the last pharaoh who had escaped from Bite City during the chaos of the devils. "With my power, I bestow upon thee my true name, Marco," Barzub said softly. Following his words, Mako's smoke-like soul suddenly emitted a dazzling blood-red light and rushed to the nearest salt marsh giant in an instant and entered its body. The unlucky salt marsh giant immediately convulsed and struggled as if he was drowning. In fact, this kind of giant would not drown at all. Not only that, but because of instinct, this monster suddenly jumped up and hugged another salt marsh giant that was swimming past him. In an instant, the other salt marsh giant seemed to be infected and began to convulse as well. When the salt marsh giants at the back realized that something was wrong, there were already 7 or 8 salt marsh giants hugging each other and crazily convulsing in the sea. Moreover, with this specific frequency of convulsions, their flesh and blood that were in contact with each other seemed to have some strange changes. The flesh and blood of these salt marsh giants strangely fused together. At first, it was like a candle that had been burned and slowly melted. Then, because it came into contact with the surrounding cold sea water, it quickly condensed together. In a very short period of time, this kind of change was repeated and carried out without interruption. Soon, the 7 or 8 salt marsh giants turned into a strange ball of flesh. Puff! Like a cocoon bursting, a worm-like monster suddenly drilled out of the ball of flesh. This monster looked like a huge leech. Except for the ring-shaped, blood-sucking mouth part on one end, the other end of its body, strangely, had a total of 9 heads, 8 large and 1 small. Barzub turned Mako into an unreal demon. The unreal demon was also known as the Daravi demon. This worm-like devil was a powerful controller. They could easily occupy the bodies of powerful mortals and play with them as chess pieces. Once someone tried to expose their schemes, the unreal demon could use the power of the mortals they controlled to give a deep impression to the person who dared to obstruct them. Although this kind of devil wasn't good at frontal combat, they were the top controllers of the 9 hells. Because they could casually cast dangerous spells like the strengthened magical soul pot, which could be understood as possession. They were revered by most devils. Generally speaking, an unreal demon's body was only about 16 feet long and weighed about 3,000 pounds. However, this unreal demon that Barzub had created from Pharaoh and Mako's soul was over 30 feet long and weighed an astonishing 20,000 pounds. Its flesh and blood were made of 8 salt marsh giants, so it had 8 salt marsh giant heads on one end of its body. As for the human head that belonged to Marco, it was surrounded by these 8 heads, making it difficult to see it. When it broke out of the cocoon, the salt marsh giants around it immediately reacted and attacked it. However, before their weapons could hit the devil, the 9 heads on one end of the unreal demon's body all opened their mouths. Long, snake-like tongues slithered out of their mouths, and invisible ripples spread out in all directions. Wave of exhaustion. The unreal demon used its best move. The salt marsh giants that were hit all collapsed in the water. They had lost all strength and could only float to the surface of the sea. The next second, the unreal demon's body disappeared. The few salt marsh giants that were lucky enough not to be hit all looked at each other in confusion. Chapter 989. It was not until they began to attack each other that the salt marsh giants, who were somewhat similar to the oversized toads, realized that the unreal demon had not disappeared. Instead, it had used some kind of evil spell, the magic soul pot spell, to possess its own kind and launch a sneak attack from behind. However, for these subspecies of giants belonging to the chaotic evil camp, the solution to the problem was very simple. It was as if they had learned it by themselves. Many of them instantly understood what to do. As long as they killed the others, the sneak attack would naturally cease to exist. However, this idea itself was secretly implanted in their minds by the unreal demon using the group suggestion spell. Flesh and blood splattered everywhere, and broken limbs danced in the air. Before the salt marsh giants could even touch the main character, they were directly defeated by a small guard that Barzub had created. Witnessing all this, the god of bugbears, Hrughek, could not help but curse out loud. Trash, these trash. However, although he, as the incarnation of a god, could easily see the unreal demon that had turned into a spiritual state because it was about to cast the magic soul pot spell, he did not personally intervene to stop the evil demon from slaughtering the warriors that he had summoned. He was assessing the situation. Sending an incarnation to the world of ashes, the god of bugbears, Hrughek, had long been prepared to bury it here, on the premise that the sacrifice was worth it. With a clear understanding of himself, it was absolutely impossible to kill Barzub, the demon king of hell, with just an incarnation. And to achieve this goal, he had to use all the power he could to weaken the winged insect lord, and then use his incarnation to launch a fatal blow. I hope you're not lying to me. Otherwise, there will be 2 more names of demon kings on my revenge list, Hrughek thought to himself. Just as Barzub had expected, the god of bugbears was not so well informed. The reason why he had so coincidentally arrived when the former was exiled was that 2 guys had tipped him off. Moreover, the two guys had also promised him, "We will not let you fight alone. You and I have the same goal." Stepping on the calm surface of the sea, the god's clone once again cast his divine spell. He swung the mace in his hand and smashed it into the air around him. After a muffled sound, a hole immediately appeared beside him. Krugak reached his hand into the hole and scratched it twice. Soon after, a goblin bear was pulled out. "Ant, today is your lucky day," the god of Earth Spirit Bear said slowly as he stared at his descendant with his dark yellow eyes. The other party was a native bugbear who had lived in the Ash World for some years. He was originally a slave leader in a certain family of the Wandering Drow clan. His milky white eyes darted around. Although he was as strong as a black bear, he looked like a doll in the hands of the even stronger Hrughek. "You are," before this goblin bear could finish his words, Hrughek's garlic-like nose immediately issued a cold humph. 2 puffs of yellow smoke spurted out from his nostrils. Like 2 earthworms, the yellow smoke wriggled into the Earth Spirit Bear's mouth that was wide open due to suffocation. In an instant, the Earth Spirit Bear began to convulse. Hrughek casually tossed it forward. "You want to fight, right? Although I'm certainly not as good as you. I'm still a great true god," Hrughek thought in his heart. His throw was quite accurate, and his convulsing descendant flew directly toward the unreal demon that was wreaking havoc. Like a cannonball, the Earth Spirit Bear directly smashed into a salt marsh giant that was waving an old ship anchor. With a loud bang, the subspecies giant exploded into a pile of minced meat. The unreal demon that was originally attached to its body had no choice but to reveal his true body. Roar! Mako, the unreal demon, floated on the surface of the water and roared at Hrughek. Together with the huge ring-shaped mouth on his tail, his 10 mouths roared at the same time. However, just as this high-ranked Batsa devil issued a challenge to the god of Earth Spirit Bears, something unexpected happened. Loud, harsh, and painful slaps fell on all of Mako's mouths at the same time. The way of beating, confidence shattered. The Earth Spirit Bear that smashed the salt marsh giant that Mako had attached to stop convulsing and stood up straight from the surface of the sea. Previously, Hrughek did not just use it as a cannonball. Instead, he changed this descendant of his into a Lord of Fear. This was the Earth Spirit Bear's unique, anti-holy samurai profession variant. The so-called anti-holy samurai, as the name implied, was an evil profession that adhered to the path of virtue that the sacred samurai adhered to. Hrughek had this ability because he had joined the god of tyranny, Ban, after the magic plague incident. A Earth Spirit Bear's Lord of Fear was often obsessed with causing pain, confusion, and suffering. Not only were they good at spreading negative emotions among their enemies, but they also liked to use these fears to affect more people, dragging them all into formless chaos and inexplicable panic. Just like the sacred samurai's signature skill was the evil slaying slash, the Earth Spirit Bear's Lord of Fear also had its own representative spell-like ability. They were familiar with the way of beating. As long as they had enough strength, they could simulate the effect of a magic slap and make their opponents tremble in fear by slapping their faces. In addition, this way of beating that they practiced was more or less meant to destroy the opponent. After slapping Mako, the Earth Spirit Bear's Lord of Fear did not say anything and pounced on the enemy who was caught off guard. This move was called One Pounce Down. Then he stretched out his arm and used the choke move to strangle the throat of the elusive demon's body that was full of heads. Because he'd been transformed into the Lord of Fear, his body had grown a lot, so he was able to strangle his target. Originally, this Earth Spirit Bear's body had a lot of black bristles. Now, these bristles had all turned into sharp, long needles, piercing into the slug-like body of the elusive demon. As he kept swaying, these long needles kept stirring the demon's flesh and blood. Marco let out a howl. Although the Lord of Terror's attacks didn't deal a lot of damage, the pain it caused was real. The elusive demon, who had been transformed from Pharaoh's soul and had almost never experienced the baptism of bloody battles, was actually much stronger than the Lord of Fear. But because of the pain, he felt some fear in his heart. Fear is my food. The Earth Spirit Bear's Lord of Fear laughed wildly. He felt the opponent's fear. It would bring him power. In particular, the fear that he had absorbed from the demons of the lower world was something he had never seen before. It was also the peak of his life. Chapter 990. The bugbears had an old proverb, which was said to have come from a bandit who blocked their way. 1,000-year-old treasure is within reach, but will be burned in the face of imminent peril. In other words, the treasure was within reach, but it couldn't be approached due to the situation. It was very similar to the bugbears. Although some of these creatures were cunning and treacherous, there were still impulsive and chaotic factors in their bodies. In certain situations, they would act very irrationally. For example, right now, the lucky bugbear who had been forcibly promoted by Herajek to become the legendary Lord of Fear used its class's own, more or less troublesome, means of beating up Mako the elusive devil, and immediately became arrogant and complacent. He howled and made a lot of incomprehensible roars. Relying on the spikes on his body that were transformed from his hair, he kept swinging his fists and punching the unreal devil. But in fact, this kind of damage was not a big deal for a senior demon. If he had more experience, he wouldn't indulge in this kind of meaningless beating that could only bring him the pleasure of bullying the strong. Unfortunately, he was just venting his instincts. Therefore, after the initial pain and fear, the Batsuit devil, who had been molded by Barzab with the soul of Mako, the last pharaoh of Medici, quickly adjusted his mentality. After all, the unreal demon was a kind of demon with very high intelligence and perception. In hell, it was also known for its flexible mind. You're courting death. The unreal demon's 10 mouths spoke at the same time. Then his slug-like body suddenly expanded and contracted like a punctured water ball. All the wounds pierced by the spikes on the Lord of Fear's body spurted out gurgling water. Of course, this was not a real water, nor was it the unreal demon's body fluid, but a real strong acid. Since his opponent wanted to fight him in close combat, he would not hesitate to let himself be covered by the acid. The spikes could pierce his body, and the strong acid could also burn the skin of the Lord of Fear. Come on, let's hurt each other and see who can't help but admit defeat first. The result was obvious. Although the Earth Spirit Bear liked to torture, it didn't have a high tolerance for pain. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been just the head of a slave army of a wandering drow clan. The bugbear goblin, who was tough and ambitious, would have killed himself long ago to become a scarred warrior. Therefore, after being burned by the acid, the guy let go of the unreal demon's arm and stepped back on the surface of the sea. Moreover, perhaps because he was a little embarrassed, he even vented his resentment on the surrounding salt marsh giants who had just luckily escaped from Mako's hands. With one punch, he killed his only remaining teammates. To be honest, upon seeing this scene, even Hrughek, who had portrayed him as the Lord of Fear, couldn't help but laugh. Idiot, idiot, you're just a pile of mud that can't be helped. The god of Earth Spirit Bear cursed loudly. Because of the anger of the god's incarnation, there were faint signs of storms gathering in the surrounding sea. However, even so, the god of Earth Spirit Bear didn't kill the Lord of Fear, who had humiliated him, because Hrughek couldn't care less about the god of Earth Spirit Bear now. The people he had summoned before had finally arrived. In addition to the salt marsh giants who had arrived at the battlefield first, but didn't actually have any use at all, after half an hourglass, the intelligent creatures who had been hiding in the nearby sea to avoid the forced migration of the scale of perpetual order had arrived here one after another. Among them, some pirates were the most eye-catching. They were even native residents of the main island city and were only nominally vassals of the Zagan family. In fact, most of the time, these guys were doing their own things. Therefore, a few days ago, when the fleet of the scale of perpetual order arrived at the main island city, they all retreated to the secret bases of the various groups. They wanted to avoid the limelight first and wait until the storm calmed down before they sail according to the wind. And because the forced evacuation order of the Chamber of Commerce was too sudden, they couldn't find all these guys at once. Many of them were still hiding in the secret bases, but they were all influenced by the god of Earth spirit bear, Hrughek. Under the stimulation of divine power, they imagined all kinds of things in their minds. Transport ships full of gold coins, smuggling boats carrying spices from the south, or some rare treasures that couldn't appear at sea at all. But without exception, those things were the manifestation of greed in their consciousness. Wealth moved people's hearts, and wine and lust boosted courage. Because their minds were hooked, these pirates who were still avoiding the disaster actually raised their sails and anchored, responding to Hrughek's call. Their numbers weren't many, but they weren't few either. There were more than 100 galleys of different sizes gathered together, which added up to about 3,000 to 4,000 people. Because of the temptation of God, these pirates who might have had some conflicts with each other gathered together. Not only did they not fight, but they also gathered together to form a pirate fleet. They weren't even afraid of the hull being damaged. Many of the ships were even tightly connected, as if there was a small piece of land on the sea out of thin air. Good, good, good. Looking at this motley crew, the god of Earth Spirit Bear said good 3 times in a row. He didn't expect to rely on these guys to challenge Barzab. The reason why he summoned them was that Hrughek had other plans. The number of people is almost enough. Hrughek narrowed his eyes. The sharp teeth in his mouth were tightly clenched, and from the gap of his teeth came out a sentence that sounded creepy. With these sacrifices, it's enough. He swung his arm and threw the warhammer in his hand at a group of pirate ships. With a muffled sound, the warhammer smashed the mast of the ship and smashed through its upper deck. On that ship, many pirates were frightened by this sudden change. When they came back to their senses, they found that the deck that was smashed by the warhammer suddenly began to gush out scarlet blood. It began to spurt outward with a chee-chee sound. Abandon the ship. Quickly abandon the ship. As the captain, the pirate leader reacted immediately. But before he finished his words, the strange blood that suddenly emerged turned into a thick fog and wrapped the entire galleys in it. Ah, help! Monster, monster! Fight it out with them. Don't eat me. The captain is more delicious. Chapter 991. At the edge of the Zagan family settlement in the main island city, there was a cliff that looked like a sharp horn. At the top of the cliff, there was a towering boulder that looked like a mighty ship about to sail towards the sun. If someone cut open the boulder, they would find that there was actually a different world inside. A megalosaurus, which had turned into a quantum state and whose size and shape could not be described, was holding a tetrahedron-shaped crystal in its mouth, which was kept in the center of an armillary sphere. The quantum megalosaurus was undoubtedly Keys, and there was no other in the entire multiverse. The armillary sphere was the assembly gate that Keys had just taken from Yinagu, the Knoll god, a few days ago. The crystal in its mouth was the treasure that Keys had brought out from the tomb of the astral dragon, the original stone of the previous godslayer, Ma Yuan. With the 3 combined, the purpose of the young blue dragon was not difficult to guess. He just wanted to use this gravitational slingshot that had been collected to advance his age level. After all, the Ash world was now facing an unprecedented crisis. An archdevil of Bador that was comparable to the greatest true god had actually managed to descend in his true body. If he did not let himself become an adult, Keys was a little uncertain about facing that kind of enemy. Unlike the previous situations when he broke through his age level, with the help of the gravitational slingshot, which was originally created by the 9-faced dragon god, Io, to spread the megalosaurus throughout the multiverse, Keys not only did not fall into a deep sleep, but also remained absolutely awake. He had a hunch that in 2 days, the advancement ceremony would be completed. During this time, his brain had not stopped working. The gravitational lines from all directions were equivalent to his eyes, outlining everything that was happening around him. As if watching a live broadcast, Keys had been staring at Barzab's movements. Oh, another god's avatar. Huh. The last pharaoh of Medicus really fell into the hands of the lord of flying insects. Wow, how tyrannical, using divine power to create a legend. There's no twist. It's a free legend. Tisk, I told you to leave earlier, but you didn't. Now you can't leave. When Keyes saw the blood mist covering the entire pirate ship, he knew what Hrugheck was thinking. The god of the bugbear goblin was making a sacrifice. He used the ordinary things that he had deceived as sacrifices to summon something. It was a group of bats-a-devil. They were all skillfully brandishing a large, ferocious-looking saw blade machete. A large number of twisted and terrifying barbs grew from the surface of their bodies, covering their bodies below their wide mouths. They were so densely packed that they looked like they were wearing chain armor. As a god, he didn't summon his own petitioners. That's right, petitioners don't have much use in the Ash world. Instead, he summoned a group of barbed goblins from the 9 prisons of Bader. Keyes secretly thought, this god of the bugbear goblin must have colluded with some existence in the 9 prisons of Bader, and the only demon qualified to collude with a god is, as if to confirm his guess, as the people on the first sailboat were killed by the barbed goblins. More blood immediately filled the blood mist. This strange mist suddenly expanded a lot and shrouded some other ships. And all the pirate ships that were shrouded by the mist had demons that came out of the gate between realms. Most of them were barbed goblins and a small number of bone goblins, chain goblins. When the blood mist shrouded all the pirate ships, there was finally an organized group of elite infantry from hell that came out of the gate between realms. Those guys were humanoid creatures in armor, covered in dust and cobwebs. When they moved, they were like clumsy beasts, exuding a terrifying aura that kept people away. Through a series of cumbersome but agile movements, these Batsu goblins uniformly pulled out their giant swords from their sheaths. Steel goblins? Keyes recognized these demons that looked very similar to humans. They were steel goblins, or bullos, soldiers who fought on the front line of the infernal battlefield. Every steel goblin was a very smart and cunning enemy, good at using a variety of tactics to win and defeat the enemy. Generally speaking, they were born to be soldiers, and the meaning of their existence was to fight. Steel goblins would put their lives on the line to destroy things that might threaten the 9 prisons. When they did not participate in the war, they would return to the barracks inside the infernal fortress, where they were always ready for the next war. They were very good at finding and killing spellcasters who were particularly troublesome or demons with magic abilities. The reason why they had such an ability was that they had the ability to accelerate in a short period of time, to form a dense formation, and the more they gathered, the greater their combat strength would be. At the same time, when facing spellcasters, steel goblins would let out a terrifying, rhythmic screech like the sound of metal being filed against each other. If the opponent did not know how to cast spells without incantations, then when chanting the incantation, they would have to undergo an appraisal of interrupted casting. If they did not pass, then the spell would not be successfully cast. Generally speaking, the most common place to see steel goblins was the bloody battlefield, but the steel goblins on duty there would not listen to anyone's summons, and they had to be constantly vigilant against the spellcasters of the Thanner Re-Demons. For hundreds of steel goblins to respond to Hrugheck summons in a dense formation, the biggest possibility was that they all came from this, the second layer of the 9 prisons of Bader. This was because other than the bloody battlefield where there was an unlimited supply of logistics, only in this city of steel could there be enough Bartholomew to forge the seamless body of this Batsa-Devil. Despat, you're the one behind this. Since the abnormality in this sea could not escape Keyes' surveillance, it could not escape the eyes of Barzab, who was like a towering giant. This insect lord, whose lower body was hidden under the sea and whose upper body was exposed, stared with his huge eyes that were like city gates and suddenly let out a furious roar. Noisy, do you still need me to teach you the principle of winner takes all? You old slug, the longer you live. Don't hit people in the face and don't expose people's shortcomings when scolding them. However, the second Lord Despat did not play by the rules. A cold and emotionless sarcastic remark suddenly sounded from the sea area shrouded in blood mist. It was unknown what method Despat used, but although the voice of this sentence did not sound loud, the range of transmission was astonishingly far. Not only did Quess, who was hiding in the dark and observing them, heard it clearly, but he also received a radio message from the scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce. Even the citizens in some cities in the south of Medici also heard the same taunting words. The young blue dragon could not help but sigh. This despot is really ruthless. Not only does he kill people, but he also wants to drag people down with him. Chapter 992. Why did he say that despot was ruthless? This was because he had angered Barzab, but more importantly, he had dragged the entire Ash world down with him. The Lord of Flying Insects was the most famous perfectionist in the 9 prisons of Bader. His pursuit of perfection was definitely a kind of morbid. Being turned into a slug by the Astamores was the shame of his life, and at the same time, it was also a thorn in his heart forever. In the land of Bartholomew's 9 hells, other than the other lords, but they would not make enemies for no reason. No one dared to use the word slug to describe Bartholomew. This was because not only did those who dared to speak like that, but even Batsu, who dared to hear the word slug, would be mercilessly destroyed by the 7th Lord and turned into a demon who had died in vain. Despot had deliberately spread the word throughout the Ash world. His purpose was to make Barzab raise his butcher's knife against all the creatures in this plane. If he really did that, then he would become the common enemy of all the creatures in this plane, and everyone would fight him to the death. And if he did not do that, Despot would not suffer any losses. After all, he would be disgusted by his old enemy. The result was just as the 2nd Lord had imagined. The Lord of Flying Insects, Barzab, was instantly enraged. He stirred up a powerful force and set off a wave that was as high as a 10-story building. It rushed toward the area covered by the blood mist like an avalanche. In the path of the wave, Mako and the Lord of Fear, who were still in a state of confrontation, were overturned by the sudden wave and crashed into the blood mist that covered more than 100 pirate ships. It was time to test the extent of their stubbornness. The blood-red mist suddenly became like an iron wall. The Lord of Illusion and the Lord of Fear, who were wrapped in the sea water, crashed into it, and both of them made a dong-dong sound when they collided with a hard object. All the devils that had been summoned just now were looking at the 2 victims calmly. These 2 guys, whether it was the Lord of Fear or the Lord of Fear, were actually much more powerful than them. It was due to this reason that the demons were overjoyed. After all, they weren't the ones suffering now. More than 4,000 pirates were killed. Apart from the blood that flowed out from their broken bodies into the blood mist, the rest of the blood had already dyed the decks of the sailboats red. Under the protection of Despot's will, the blood under the feet of the devils was not washed away by the waves due to the obstruction of the freshly transformed blood mist. They gradually began to gather around each other, forming a pool of blood. As the viscous blood gradually condensed, the broken pieces of flesh piled up. On the decks of the galleys, blood-red mirrors of various sizes appeared. All of a sudden, many small devils that looked like large bats with sharp teeth, watermelon-like heads on their necks, and arrow-shaped tails on their backs rushed out of the mirror. The imps first let out shrill but excited howls, expressing their excitement of coming to the material plane in the infernal language. Then, they landed around the mirror. This was a signal. These imps had a unique mission. They were all here to be executioners. To be honest, as the creatures at the bottom of the evolution sequence of the Batsu people, it was actually very difficult for these imps to get the high-class job of executioner. In the 9 prisons of Bader, many demons were masters of torture and torture. Executing the destruction of other creatures was one of their hobbies. Demons, such as chain demons and bone demons, were undoubtedly much more efficient than imps to do the job of executioner. However, this did not conform to the rules of the ritual that was about to be carried out. Demons were evil, but they were most particular about rules. Especially when it came to serious matters like war, they would all carry out orders meticulously. Therefore, the imps got the opportunity to humiliate and kill their own kind this time. Around each blood-red mirror stood a circle of imps with hacksaws and axes in their hands. Next came the inferior demons that were lower than the imps. In the 9 prisons of Bader, they were also called foundations, or to be more precise, them. They were all transformed from those cursed souls that fell into hell. Their appearance was like a lump of constantly trembling rotten meat. They were the lowest type of Batsa devil. A trace of memory vaguely remained in their minds, as well as a subconscious implanted by hell, would drive the mindless inferior demons to constantly imitate their own bodies to the demons that tortured them. Of course, this process would take a very long time if there were no higher-level demons that could discern the talents. During this period, most of the time, they could only maintain a ridiculous and worthless appearance. From their appearance, it was impossible to tell what kind of creature they used to be. Inferior demons could create a bunch of terrifying faces that constantly changed, or just maintained their bodies in a bloated state of rotten meat. The only functioning organs left in its body were its thick, short, and gnarled limbs. Its main function was to tear any non-hell creatures that got too close to it into pieces. In the later stage of evolution, inferior demons that could maintain their solid state were usually about 4 feet tall and 200 pounds. However, most of the inferior demons could only maintain themselves in a deformed state of melting. Although inferior demons were ugly and disgusting, they were still very valuable to the fallen society of hell. These lumps of meat that had been tempered by the power of hell for many years, although they had no thoughts, were filthy and vicious. In many of the demon's spells, inferior demons were used as materials. The demon's method of using inferior demons was very simple. They would gather as many inferior demons as they wanted to do, and then slaughter them as they wished, turning them into real piles of rotten meat. The dead inferior demons would release all the hellish aura that they had accumulated in their miserable lives, which contained the power of the rules of the 9 prisons of Bader. In fact, other than the inferior demons, and possibly the bloated demon, who was not very clear-headed, and the Nether River Memoristealer, who was powerful but had a terrible brain, the other demons knew this method of using inferior demons. The little demons that were released earlier were originally surrounding the blood-red mirror, waiting obediently. However, when the inferior demons rushed out in a frenzy, they immediately surrounded them, using the weapons in their hands or simply their claws and teeth to start a massacre. The inferior demons that had just arrived in the material plane were immediately turned into piles of dead meat. As the imps slaughtered, they used the flesh and blood as materials to construct triumphal portal-like structures on the deck of the sailboat. The style was very strange. Chapter 993. It was clearly a building made of flesh and blood, but the moment these triumphal arches were built, they would turn into something similar to a black rock building. This made Keyes, who had been observing the situation from afar, a little interested. It seems like the skull pillars are made of this material. In fact, the young Blue Dragon's guess was actually very accurate. The iconic building of the 9 prisons of Bader in Avernus used countless demon skulls as decorations, and its foundation was indeed made of the flesh and blood of inferior demons. This symbolized the order that the demons believed in. The merit of killing demons came from the sacrifice of their flesh and blood. When this black rock building was piled up into the shape of a Hell's Gate, it symbolized that the demons had already decided that the demons that would surge out from this gate would ultimately obtain the ultimate victory in this place, and they would not return without victory. Therefore, when he saw this scene, even the lord of the flying insects, Barzab, could not help but be a little moved. He had originally thought that Despat was fooling around, and that he wanted to play some dirty tricks again. Who would have thought that the second suzerain would be so determined to launch a serious hell war to annihilate him? Don't be fooled by the fact that there were only a dozen or so triumphal arches erected on the broken pirate station ships. The key problem was that the Hell's Gate was a symbol, and there was definitely an army behind it that was ready to set off. He really did put in a lot of effort. Barzab thought to himself. He tried to attack the blood fog again. This time, the blood fog that was summoned using thousands of lives as sacrifices was indeed not as rigid as before. Many spells penetrated the blood fog and struck the vanguard troops from the 9 prisons of Bader, reaping the lives of a wave of Batsu devil. However, the moment these devils died, their souls did not fall into the 9 prisons of Bader according to the body and soul as one characteristic of otherworldly creatures, and wait for 99 years to be reborn. The little devils who acted as executioners were all excitedly fighting to drag the bodies of the superior devils into the construction site of the Hell's Gate and stacking them into the cracks of the bricks. Just like what was said before, they would not return without victory. Since the Hell's Gate had been built, including the vanguard troops, none of the troops could retreat to the 9 prisons before the mission was accomplished. Even if they died here, they had to contribute to the final victory. Barzub, you're definitely going to die this time. Ha ha. The god of the bugbears, Hrughek, laughed wildly. He felt that he had made the right bet this time. Even if his allies were devils who were known for their scheming, they were definitely on the same side of the goal of killing Barzub. Thinking of this thought, the incarnation of the god no longer hesitated. He once again revealed another trump card of his. The god of the bugbears began to call for his ally, the god of goblin slavery, Kugo-Bayag, to descend. Come here to fulfill your honor, the principle of the social order that you scrupulously abide by. Trample a devil lord under your feet, and your status will be elevated. Believers will be more convinced of your strength, and you will surpass your main god. All gods were restricted by their own priesthoods, and except for a few gods or demigod powers, most of the remaining gods had to constantly pursue and practice the path of priesthoods, especially the many gods of the Order faction. Therefore, with the identity of an ally, and with the appropriate persuasion method, the god of goblin slavery, Kugo-Bayag, responded to Hrughek almost immediately. Although he did not send out his strongest incarnation like the other party, this goblin god still sent one of his incarnations to the Ashen World. Based on the nature of this world, it was not easy to do so. My ally, accompanied by a crackling sound similar to the tip of a whip in the air, the surrounding sea area and the sparkling force field fence pierced from the ground to the sky, as well as the uncontrollable depression in the hearts of almost all the mortals nearby, Kugo-Bayag's incarnation appeared. His appearance was like a tall and muscular goblin, with orange and yellow scales dotted on his flaming red skin. He carried a whip in his hand and wore armor that seemed to be woven with dragon scales. Kugo-Bayag's incarnation descended, and at the same time, he brought along his slave army. This was the characteristic of his priesthoods. As this god waved his whip on the sea surface, there would be dozens or even hundreds of sea goblins appearing out of thin air every time. Because this was a battle on the sea, the god of slavery of the goblin race specifically chose the sea goblin subspecies, the sea goblin. Although this act of summoning goblin slaves was not actually created out of thin air, but was temporarily conscripted from the planes of the multiverse that had their own beliefs, in theory, this mode of rampaging soldiers also had its own upper limit, with the power of his priesthoods to mobilize slaves from all the worlds. Kugo-Bayag still became a powerful god, second only to the king of gods in the goblin spiritual system. Even though, in fact, in terms of divinity, he was only a weak god, the goblin or earth goblin society could not function without this god of slavery. As soon as he made his move, he began to rampage his soldiers. Those sea goblins were creatures with big heads and many teeth. From the waist up, they looked like goblins, and their lower body was a fat octopus-like body. The sea goblins were about 4 feet tall from head to tentacles. Although they were not big in size, they were violent creatures that liked to inflict pain on others. They were classified as harmful monsters in the coastal areas of many material planes. You squids, if you want to become a real octopus, then go and flatten that tower. As the god of slavery of the goblins, Kugo-Bayag naturally knew how to control slaves. The sea goblins thought that octopuses were the most beautiful creatures, and squids are the most ugly creatures. If saying that the sea goblins were like octopuses was a compliment, saying that they were like squids was the most intolerable insult. In addition, these slaves did not dare to disobey the gods. Therefore, their resentment of being called squids could only be vented in the direction pointed out by Kugobayag. This resentment was so strong that it even overpowered the fear brought to them by the giant Barzab. They knew that they were going to die, but they still launched an attack without hesitation. Keys, who had been monitoring this place, saw that Kugobayag used the method of rampage to attack and immediately classified him as a useless teammate. The group of sea goblins that he summoned was not like the demon army near Hellgate Fortress, who was protected by the rules of the 9 prisons of Bader. Against the current Barzab, they were purely charging the enemy. Seeing this scene, Keys did not know whether to curse or not. If it were not for the fact that he was in the process of evolution and could not break away from the restraint of the gravitational slingshot, he even wanted to run out and beat up Kugobayag's pig head. Chapter 994. This is an excellent supplement. Hell's Gate Fortress was still being built and could launch an attack at any time. Barzab could only wait patiently. But before this, he had only supplemented the souls of 100 salt marsh giants and used them to create the illusory demon Mako. But now, with the god of goblin slavery Kugobayag's violent attacks, the insect lord that was bound to the soul-shackling tower had many more materials. Every minute, every second, as long as Kugobayag waved his whip, dozens and hundreds of sea goblin slaves would be summoned from other material planes in the multiverse. Many grains of sand would make a tower, and many little grains would make an ocean. Even if Barzab didn't use any spells and merely moved the fingers of his gigantic upper body, the amount of energy he used to kill 1, 2, or even several hundred sea goblins was still a huge loss compared to the amount of energy he gained in battle. But as the enemy continued to increase his strength and kill the sea goblins, Barzab could easily capture their souls and make use of them with the soul-shackling tower. In other words, he was slowly turning his losses into profits. The more sea goblins there were, the more powerful he would become. In the beginning, in order to conserve his energy, he was still carefully distributing his energy and smashing those ants to death like whack-a-mole. But when the horde of sea goblins appeared on the surface of the sea and surrounded the Lord of Hell's true body, he no longer had to be so careful. He could casually kill hundreds or even thousands of sea goblin slaves and absorb their souls. With a little kneading, he could create new powerful creatures that could resist these little monsters. And these creatures could also become Barzab's warriors and help him fight against the legion of devils that was about to leave Hell's Gate Fortress. Trash will always be trash. You don't know what war is, the insect lord thought to himself. In fact, if not for his good control of his expression, he would have been overjoyed. Goblins, great goblins, and other goblin-like creatures are clearly some of the most intelligent creatures in the multiverse, but they still haven't been able to give birth to a proper divine domain of war. To put it bluntly, these guys don't know how to fight at all. They only know how to use crude tactics to add fuel to the fire. Of course, although he despised them in his heart, Barzab didn't fall behind at all on the surface. For example, with the souls of thousands of sea spirits, he had clearly created 20 to 30 powerful monsters that were half human and half shark and had the bloodline of devils. However, when dealing with the groups of sea goblins, he only released 1 or 2 as a cover for the purpose of resisting the attacks of the smaller monsters. More warriors received his orders and hid in the depths of the sea, waiting for further orders. For example, Barzab could have increased the power of illusory Mako to the point where he could instantly kill Dread Bugbear, but Barzab had been holding back. He kept Illusory's power hanging by a thread. Therefore, under his deliberate protection, the situation of the war was always in a stalemate. In fact, Barzab was gaining more power every moment. He was just accumulating it and didn't use it casually. My ally, the goblin god of slavery, Kugobayag, was a little speechless. His arm was a little sore from waving the whip tens of thousands of times and summoning hundreds of thousands of sea goblin slaves. However, the battle still hadn't affected the Lord of Hell. After all, a god was a god. He could more or less see something unnatural. Therefore, he took the initiative to speak to Hrughek, the god of bugbears, I can't summon an army without limit. Otherwise, the fragile balance of the goblin society will be broken, and the other goblin gods will declare war on me. If you have any other tricks, you have to use them now. I'm only an ordinary avatar here, but you've sent your strongest avatar." At this point, Sui Xiong had made it clear to the gods. Kugo-Bayag could see that Hrughek was determined to kill Barzab. He knew that Hrughek must have made sufficient preparations to send his strongest avatar to the world of ashes, which was a great restriction for the gods. The Legion of Devils and Kugo-Bayag's divine ally were definitely not all of Hrughek's trump cards. Don't worry, my friend. Hrughek didn't look at Kugo-Bayag's eyes. He was staring straight at Barzab, who was casting powerful spells from time to time in the distance. You just need to surround him. I do have some tricks up my sleeve. Now is the time to show them to everyone. As he spoke, the god of bugbears, who was so tall and muscular that he did not look like a bugbear, leaped high into the air. He grasped the hammer in his hand with both hands and smashed it viciously at the heads that hovered around him. Pa 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 pa. Several heads were smashed in succession, which really shocked Kugo-Bayag, who was watching from the side. The latter knew that most of the goblin god were not good at using magic power, especially Hrughek, who was known for his savagery and cruelty. The reason why he could use magic was that he had mastered this set of divine artifacts. However, for some unknown purpose, Hrughek destroyed it without hesitation. This action of his made Kugo-Bayag stunned. What was he trying to do? The goblin god of slavery was still pondering, but at this moment, the radiance of another celestial body replaced the eternal blaze, even though it was not night yet. A full moon abruptly appeared in the sky, emitting brilliant light. Under the moonlight, a detestable-looking Onababa covered in filth appeared out of thin air on the surface of the sea. She had a mottled brown skin, with sparse hair peeling off from her bald scalp. She was holding a bubbling iron pot in her hand. Kaji Luna! Kugo-Bayag recognized her immediately. No, she should be called she was actually Kaji Luna. She was an evil moon goddess, and at the same time, the guardian of Onababas, demonic Onababas, and similar fallen races in various worlds. Of course, even the Onababas themselves had no love for this goddess. They were afraid of her greed and delay, and believed that she would always be, or was always planning some scheme to take away the spoils of war that they deserved. Kikik, little bugbears, why have you summoned me? Remember your promise to summon me from the pits of the scorching hell. It cost a lot of money, ha ha. As soon as she appeared, the Onababa god greeted Hrughek loudly with an unbearable voice. Chapter 995. Kaji Luna's incarnation was a frequent visitor to the material plane. Her main purpose had always been to capture evil souls as larvae, which were actually the basic currency for her trade in the Scorched Hell in recent years. It could be seen that the goddess of Hag had recently changed her main trading partner. The souls she had previously captured were mainly used to make soul prisms. Instead of trading with demons, she was now more inclined to trade with demons. Some scholars in the multiverse believe that this might have something to do with the famous pay-the-bill operation in the Infernal Realm. They believe that the Hag Lord who once ruled the 6th floor of the 9 prisons of Bader and was executed by Asmodeus after the operation was actually an incarnation of Kaji Luna. After so many years, the eccentric and temperamental goddess of Hag had been assisting the demon Thanner in various ways, seeking justice from the Batsuit devil who had buried her incarnation. Of course, this was just a guess. As for the actual situation, no one really knew. However, many gods and demigods who often dealt with her had discovered that the goddess of Hag had indeed become greedier after the pay-the-bill operation. Although Kaji Luna was no different from a miser before, she would more or less take into account the god's reputation when trading, and her table manners were not as bad as now. Hrughek had a deep understanding of this. After all, the most important artifact of the god of bugbears, which provided him with powerful spell-casting abilities, was originally called the Skull Array licked by Hag's tongue. The goddess of Hag, Kaji Luna, was the one who had transformed the spoils of war of the god of bugbears into powerful artifacts in the end. For this, they had even signed a contract with the Nether River. "I'll fill up your bottles and jars, old hack." In the face of Kaji Luna's questioning, Hrughek did not answer directly because there were other gods and demigods present. He shouted back in an unfriendly tone, "Now, according to our agreement, before this artifact is repaired, you still have to provide spell-casting services for me." The god of Earth Spirit Bear's heart was bleeding, but at the same time, he was secretly delighted. Previously, he had signed an agreement with Kaji Luna. On the surface, it was to make up for his shortcomings in spell-casting ability. That was why he had accepted the goddess of Anababa's offer. The work of creating and repairing artifacts must be handed over to Kaji Luna. Every time, the reward will be 3 jars of Anababa medicine bottles filled with larvae. One had to know that the medicine bottles that Kaji Luna left for him were not big, but each of them could hold 6,666 larvae. In other words, every time Hrughek's artifact malfunctioned, he would have to provide the goddess with nearly 200,000 larvae to fix it. If the larvae were to be converted into soul prisms, he would be able to get close to 500,000 standard soul prisms. In other words, Kaji Luna completely treated Hrughek as a fool. If the god of Earth Spirit Bear was willing to spend more money to fix this artifact, he might be able to buy a new artifact from some merchants from the lower plains. However, Hrughek still forced himself to sign the Styx River contract, which was exactly what he had planned for today. According to the Styx River contract, when the artifact was damaged, Kaji Luna still had to provide magic assistance to Hrughek. Once the divine artifact was repaired, the goddess of Ghost Nanny would be able to leave in a serious manner and wait for the next payment. Just now, Hrughek had personally smashed the skull array licked by Anababa's tongue with a hammer. He had used pure divine power, and the damage he had caused was quite expensive to repair. At the same time, it would take a lot of time. Therefore, due to the restrictions of the Styx River contract, Kaji Luna had to come to the world of ashes. If one had to explain it in more vivid terms, it could only be said that Hrughek, a god who did not look very smart, after all, Earth Spirit Bear was not known for its intelligence, had used his unique cunning and wealth to buy an artifact from the goddess of Anababa in exchange for a chance to help him. If such an opportunity was not used well, it would be a great loss. But now, when facing the real body of a Lord of Hell, Hrughek had gained a lot with the help of a magic expert like Kaji Luna. Next time, I have to pay more. The goddess of Anababa was not a fool. At first, she had thought that she was here to harvest leeks, but now she realized that she was here to harvest leeks. However, the Styx contract could not be violated. At least for a weak divine power like him, if he violated the contract, there was only one price he would have to pay, and that was he would definitely die. Therefore, even though she was very reluctant, she still let out a long roar and threw the small iron pot in her hand into the sea beside her. In an instant, under the pale moonlight, the small iron pot suddenly turned into a big cauldron. Although there was no firewood under it, it seemed to be emitting heat all the time. Even the seawater around it was boiling. She took out about 30 eyeballs from the bag that seemed to be woven with pearls. They were all real eyeballs that Kaji Luna had dug out from the eye sockets of her own family. Each eyeball was the size of a goose egg. "I won't be as reckless as you." Kaji Luna glanced at the god of Earth Spirit Bear and the Kugobayag, who was standing beside it and waving his whip. As she moved, the eyeballs in her hand all turned and glanced at the two gods. "Barzub, that's my old customer. If you want to deal with him, you have to be more careful." As he spoke, he flung his hand forcefully, and the eyeballs in his hand shot out like arrows. Streaking across the air, they disappeared without a trace. They all concealed their tracks and began to observe the spirit binding Pagoda from all angles. As mentioned before, these eyeballs were the eyes of the Anababa. They had different visions. Some could be compared to a moving camera, which could capture subtle movements that ordinary creatures could not see. Some were like the arcane magic eye, which could detect all kinds of mysterious spells. Some could peek at the traces of the use of psychic powers. Some could even see the souls of intelligent creatures. And the information collected by these eyes would all be synchronized and shared with Kaji Luna's sensory system. If she was not a great god, just receiving the various visual information from these eyes would cause the brain of an ordinary creature to crash. Chapter 996. Keyes, who was hiding in the Zagan family's mansion, was using the gravitational waves that were everywhere to observe the direction of the great war of gods and devils. Just after the Anababa goddess Kaji Luna threw out those Anababa's eyes, he observed that several invisible eyeballs were floating around the main island city. Are they going to discover me? The young blue dragon couldn't help but feel a little tempted. However, he immediately adjusted his thoughts and restrained his spirit so that he wouldn't continue to let his imagination run wild. Those Anababa's eyes each had their own characteristics. Perhaps there really were eyes that could see through one's thoughts mixed among them. However, in order to adapt to the gravitational slingshot, Keyes had transformed into a quantum state. In theory, it was impossible for him to be observed in this state. The Anababa's eyes wouldn't be able to detect him unless he had too many thoughts and overflowed some of his spirit. When Keyes collected his thoughts and concentrated on observing instead of thinking too much, those Anababa's eyes really stopped staring at the main island city. Instead, they all turned around and began to observe Barzab, who had transformed into the soul binding tower from a distance. This situation was as if there were a few spectators in front of Keyes out of thin air who couldn't discover him. Keyes guessed correctly. The reason why Kaji Luna threw out the Anababa's eyes all over the place wasn't because she had discovered Keyes' existence. She was only bound by the contract with the Styx River and had no choice but to get involved in this great war of gods and devils. Now, she had to proceed with caution. In fact, the Anababa's eyes that she threw out had already covered the surrounding hundreds of square kilometers of the sea. Not only did they exist near the main island city, which was the largest land city in the surrounding sea, but there were also several Anababa's eyes monitoring the Batsa Devil's every move in the vicinity of the Hellgate Fortress, which was constantly being built in order to guard against any trickery. Kaji Luna only took action after she constructed this kind of global view for herself. This is a habit that I have developed when I eat. A dirty and gnarled wooden spoon appeared in the goddess's hand. She stirred the soup in the cauldron with the spoon and calmly said to the impatient god bugbear, "Hrughek, you have never been to the Wild Wild, right? I often go there. The swan fairies in the pleasure palace are the most delicious food in the world. They don't need any seasoning. Just put them in the cauldron, and they are a delicacy. However, if he wanted to capture them, he would have to keep an eye on the fairy queen in the royal court and the movements of the thousands of divine beasts in the unrestrained wilderness. The reason why I'm able to eat such delicacies so often is because of the miraculous effects of the ghost nanny's eye. Plus, as she spoke, the hateful ghost nanny suddenly straightened her stooped body. Like a taut bowstring suddenly being released, she swung her arm that was holding the wooden spoon. The avocado yellow soup in the cauldron suddenly flew out and turned into thousands of strange vipers that only had heads and fangs, but their lower bodies were cut off. They opened their mouths wide and pounced on Barzab. A swift and violent strike when necessary. Kaji Luna was a little out of breath after she waved her arm, as if she had not exercised for a long time. The goddess of ghost Nanny squinted at the two goblins and said, "In a battle, the best spell is always the one that is effective. The other spells are just filler." Tens of thousands of mutated vipers pounced on Barzab, who had fused with the spirit binding tower, like fine raindrops. Even though the overlord of the flying insects was powerful, there was still a flaw in his defense, let alone when facing thousands of poisonous vipers. Many of these mutated vipers with only half of their bodies bypassed his magic protection and landed directly on his mountain-like upper body. In terms of body size, these strange vipers were the size of Barzab's upper body. It was a little underwhelming to even call them tiny. However, their fangs really pierced through the skin of the Lord of Hell's true body and the strange poison in their venom glands was injected into his body. The reason why it was called a strange poison was because it was not purely poisonous. It also had some strange properties. Some contained curses, and just a drop of it would cause the Lord of Hell's flesh to fester. Some contained some forceful properties, such as pregnancy. The viper that bit Barzub's body immediately swelled into an egg sac, giving birth to a brand new life and constantly absorbing the power of the Lord of Hell. Some were simply disgusting necromancy magic, and when the venom entered Barzub's body, it released dark corrosive damage, attempting to invade the essence of his life. Others were simply disgusting necromancy magic, and when the venom entered Barzub's body, it released dark corrosive damage, attempting to invade the essence of his life. For Barzub, the damage caused by the strange poison was a little troublesome, but overall, it was not dangerous. What really made him angry was that the Lord of Flying Insects felt that he had been humiliated. In particular, the forceful changes, such as pregnancy, transformation, and even sex change, although both the fallen angel and the slug did not seem to have gender differences, forced Barzub to cut off part of his body to get rid of the effects caused by the transformation. The egg sacs that fell out of their bodies, the lively sheep, the filthy locusts. In Barzub's eyes, it wasn't just the flesh that was falling off, it was also the loss of face that was going on. You damned, maggot-infested, ugly Onababa. It could be said that this was the first time the Lord of Flying Insects had cursed like this in the hundreds of years since he had arrived in the world of ashes. If there was a threshold for anger, his anger would definitely be off the charts. It should be known that in the 9 prisons of Bader, if the demons wanted to talk about the word slug, they would have to find a new word to replace it. Otherwise, Barzub, who was squatting in Maladomini, would hear it and then suffer the revenge of the 7th Lord. And now, Kaji Luna actually dared to slap him in the face in front of everyone. Barzub had already made up his mind. Wasn't she just a weak god? Since she had come, then there was no need for her to leave. He would definitely kill her. Following his thoughts, the will to kill was released as if it had substance. The strange snakes hanging on the surface of his body all lost their vitality in an instant. Then, the Lord of Flying Insects recited a spell. Before his voice died away, a light blue fireball suddenly appeared on the big cauldron beside Kaji Luna. As if it was affected by gravity, the fireball fell into the thick yellow soup with a plop. The ghost hag goddess was stunned. At first, she did not understand what Barzub wanted to do. This big cauldron was connected to her god's kingdom in the scorching hell. No matter how powerful Barzub was, it was impossible for him to casually summon a fireball to destroy a god's kingdom, right? However, where her mind was connected to her god's kingdom, and she wanted to find out what the Lord of Flying Insects was doing. For no reason, Kaji Luna's heart suddenly palpitated from her god's kingdom. You actually released a Phaeton for me. Chapter 997. Phaeton was a kind of abomination. Abominations were one of the most serious mistakes in the multiverse. They were products of divine power that should not exist and were not foreseen by the gods. They might be the illegitimate children of some powerful god, or the product of some indescribable taboo experiment. But without exception, abominations had already died once at the moment of their birth. But because the spark of divinity had been ignited in their bodies, as souls that had died young, abominations could still continue to live. They could absorb nourishment from their power that was close to that of a god, as well as their pure hatred for their ancestors and all natural products. Some gods who wielded the authority of flame had created abominations like Phaeton, either in a romantic encounter or simply on the forging table. Their true appearance was like a huge living flame with 8 artificial legs. The newborn Phaeton's body was reddish-orange due to the temperature of the flames in their bodies. And as they grew older and their power increased, the flames on their bodies would gradually turn blue, and they would maintain this color for most of their long lives. When they were nearing the end of their lives, or when the source of their power, the god who wielded the authority of flame, had fallen for some reason, Phaeton's body would become a pure white that could not be looked at directly. Of course, sometimes the surface of the furious Phaeton's body would also emit a pure white blazing flame. Under normal circumstances, Phaeton would be locked by the gods into the depths of the Earth's core, in the material plane, the moment they were created. There was a high-temperature environment that made them feel slightly comfortable. At the same time, the strong pressure could also ensure that they maintained a drowsy state, and it would not be so easy for them to run to the surface and cause trouble. They were like a huge mass of magma, moving through the depths of the earth and burning everything in their path. And when they woke up from their deep sleep, they would sometimes rush to the surface along with volcanic eruptions, forming a small volcanic crater at the exit, sweeping away all combustible objects or creatures that came close, or using a piece of blazing lava to create a tsunami. Generally speaking, there are only 3 options to stop Phaeton: banish him, seal him, or use a massive amount of divine power to annihilate him instantly. A powerful and brilliant spellcaster, at least a legend, might use some tricks and some luck to send a Phaeton to a world that had nothing to do with him. However, this was only a temporary solution. As long as there was something combustible in the other world, Phaethon would most likely try his best to ignite everything there before making any other considerations. However, one could not rule out the possibility that the abomination would open a gate to the other world and come back because of its homesickness, or when there was nothing left to burn. If they wanted to seal Phaeton, they would have to send him back to the depths of the Earth's core. As mentioned before, in that kind of high-pressure environment, Phaeton would become drowsy and stop. This seemed to be a more reliable method than banishing him. However, even for a legendary spellcaster, it was very difficult to achieve this. The probability of failure was more than 90%. Generally, only gods could do it. If they really wanted to solve the problem once and for all, the only way was to kill him with divine power and annihilate the spark of divinity that had been ignited in his body. However, doing so is actually no different from killing a god. At most, Phaeton would not have a god's kingdom, so the consumption of divine power would be less. However, no matter how little divine power was consumed, the amount of divine power required would be massive. Moreover, this consumption had to be one-off and could not be provided in batches. This was because using divine power to attack Phaeton would 100% infuriate him. He would become the kind of pure white ultimate Phaeton that could destroy a material plane in an instant. By then, even if he was annihilated, the material plane where Phaeton was located would be destroyed as well. Whether he was annihilated or not, in fact, it did not have much meaning. If it had to be explained in concrete terms, then the amount of divine power required to annihilate a Phaeton was about the same as the total amount of divine power required to create about 3 avatars for a mid-level divine power. For a mid-level divine power, such a huge amount of divine power was almost equivalent to their thousands of years of accumulation. Only a few great divine powers could have such a solid foundation. Therefore, even if the god who had inadvertently created Phaeton and held the authority of flame had not reached the level of great divine power, most of the time, he would not be able to correct his mistakes in the first place. He could only temporarily seal him in the core of the earth. The goddess of Hag, Kaji Luna, was only a low-level divine power. She definitely had no way to completely get rid of a Phaeton. However, Barzab had used some unknown method to banish a Phaeton into his god's kingdom. Relying on the natural connection between the god's kingdom and the gods, this evil goddess had already felt that her god's kingdom in the scorching hell had now become a place of misery and suffering. There weren't many petitioners to begin with, although Kaji Luna was a race goddess. The greedy Anababas rarely believed in such a greedy goddess, and many of them had already turned into smoldering charcoal. Damn it! The god's kingdom was not only the treasure house of the gods, but also their last home. For a low-level god like her to allow an abomination to wreak havoc in her god's kingdom was like raising 7 or 8 huskies in an apartment of dozens of square meters. It was already a certainty that the house would be demolished, and because the area was not large, the abomination's efficiency of demolishing the house was extremely terrifying. Every second in the Ashen world made Kaji Luna's heart bleed. However, due to the contract with Hrughek in the Styx River, she had to stay here until the god of bugbears chose to give up the encirclement and annihilation of Barzub. Only then could Kaji Luna return to her god's kingdom to quell the chaos caused by Phaeton. As a miser, Kaji Luna was instantly forced into a dead end. The priesthood of Hag determined that she had to be greedy, even greedier than all the other Hag. Therefore, the destruction of her god's kingdom was unacceptable to her. As for the dispute between Hrughek and Barzub, the result could be predicted even without the use of divination. The battle between the gods and their allies and the powerful Lord of Hell could last for 3 to 5 years. If that was really the case, Kaji Luna felt that it was uncertain whether she could still exist by then, just relying on her real body in the god's kingdom to suppress the Lord of Hell. "You forced me to do this." The Hag goddess looked at Barzub with incomparable hatred in her eyes. At the same time, she glanced at the 2 goblin gods who were gloating at her misfortune. Then, he threw away the wooden spoon that he had been holding in his hand, picked up the bubbling cauldron with both hands, and poured the thick soup that had always been boiling into his throat. She made a choice: temporarily give up the management of her god's kingdom and integrate the power of her real body into her avatar. She would help the god of bugbears, Hrughek, to end the battle quickly. Then, she would do her best to solve the disaster caused by Phaeton. In an instant, the ugly Hag goddess looked as if she had drunk fake wine. Her face turned red, and fine beads of sweat appeared on her skin. After drinking the thick soup, she felt as if she had swallowed a piece of coal. The heat was constantly burning her heart. She did not know whether this was caused by Phaeton's influence or simply the effect of her anger. Chapter 998. Kaji Luna felt as if she had swallowed a piece of coal in her throat. Even the 2 goblin deities standing beside her, Hrughek and Kugobayag, could see the red swelling and blisters on the dirty and black neck of the harpy goddess. Now, she had temporarily lodged her god's kingdom in her avatar, and the power of her true body had merged with this avatar. However, in this way, the damage caused by the abomination Phaeton in her god's kingdom would spread and be revealed on her avatar. Bar, TSK, TSK, TSK. Zeb. Hiss. Hiske, Fiske, Fiske. It's not over. Because of the swelling and pain in her throat, the harpy goddess words were intermittent. But even so, the hidden resentment and anger in her voice were almost obvious. That's right. He was about to explode from anger, literally. Looking at Kaji Luna, whose nostrils and ears were starting to smoke, Hrughek, the god of the bugbear goblin, could not help but grin. He revealed a devilish smile. He had gained a lot this time, and the old witch, who had only wanted to slack off, was about to get serious. "You guys cooperate with me." Kaji Luna widened her pair of yellow eyes and looked at the 2 goblin deities. Then she glanced at the Hellgate fortress that was about to take shape. "The devil bastards will arrive in this plane in an hourglass, and then they will launch an all-out attack on Barzub. Before that, we will weaken this slug as much as we can." As she spoke, she lifted the robe wrapped around her body, and this scene made the 2 goblin deities feel a little uncomfortable. "We won't eat, right? I am so cute, called Enchantress." Kaji Luna's voice was getting hoarser and hoarser, and the swelling on her throat had begun to spread to her mouth, so she was a little tongue-tied when she spoke. Keys, who observed this scene with the help of gravitational waves, almost laughed out loud. "Enchantress, why don't you call yourself 9 Cylinders?" However, the 2 goblin deities were not as joking as the young blue dragon. They all looked at Kaji Luna cautiously. It turned out that the harpy goddess had just rubbed her chest and casually rolled out a disgusting old mud ball. However, the things on a god's body, even if it was filth, was not something that ordinary people could understand. Kaji Luna had exposed her chest in front of them, and the thing she had made was definitely not an old mud ball, which contained evil divine power. This is the curse of the fairy Titania of the Joyous Palace. That legend may be true, Because he had become a god earlier, Hrughek had more knowledge than his ally, Cugablin. The god of the god of the goblin, of the god of goblins, was of god, of a secret. The Harpies were originally a subspecies of giants. However, their entire race was female, and they could only give birth to the next generation after mating with the males of other races. The children of the Harpies were 100% Harpies, and it was because of this characteristic that their race could continue to exist. However, for some reason, they were ostracized by other giants, and their goddess, Kaji Luna, was also marginalized by other giant gods. After being discriminated against for a long time, Kaji Luna had the idea of revenge. She used her attainments in making poisons to participate in the palace struggle of the giant god system that started with poison and ended with poison. The poison provided by her not only killed the second wife of the giant god of creation, Anan, who was also Kaji Luna's biological mother, but also made her twin sister, Titania, shrink in size. She changed from a giant goddess to the ancestor of the fairy creatures of the joyous palace, and naturally withdrew from the giant god system. Because of the hatred of killing her mother and losing her position, even though Titania was kind and pure in nature, she still had an uncontrollable resentment against Kaji Luna. She put it into action and cursed the Harpies with divine power. It was because of Titania's curse that the Harpies, a subspecies of giants, became as ugly as they were today. Due to the restrictions of the priesthood, the goddess of their race, Kaji Luna, gradually became ugly and deformed. She would emit a disgusting stench all the time, and disgusting mud would grow out of her body. She would age uncontrollably at every moment. Even though she was a god and had divine power, Kaji Luna would not die of ugliness. She still had to endure unspeakable pain. It was because of this that her mentality became even more vicious. In order to take revenge on Titania, Kaji Luna began to hunt the Swan Fairy, who was the favorite of Titania, from the joyous palace of the Wild. She enjoyed the pleasure of eating the Swan Fairy alive. The change of the race god also fed back to the Harpies. The Harpies developed the evil habit of eating intelligent creatures. They became monsters that everyone wanted to kill in various material planes. So far, most of the surviving Harpies could only survive in the lower world. Aren't you stubborn? Ball. Fold. Experience my pain? The attack on her kingdom almost made Kaji Luna lose her mind. Of course, it was only almost. She immediately figured out how to take revenge on Barzab, the Lord of Hell, based on his personality. She rubbed a large lump of old mud balls that was cursed by Titania, the queen of the fairies, and sent this filthy and magical lump to Barzab. In an instant, Barzab, who had been transformed into a slug by the Astamores but still tried to maintain his clean and tidy appearance, suddenly had all kinds of ulcers, acne, and other ugliness that Barzab knew or did not know about. From this, it could be seen that Kaji Luna had spent many years and effort to suppress Titania's curse. She only made the Harpies look repulsive, withered, and unable to clean themselves, and other ugliness. This attack was somewhat similar to the Thousand Snake Raid. Both attacks did not cause much damage, but they were extremely humiliating. This was a precise attack that targeted the personal preferences of the Lord of Flying Insects. Naturally, it made him go crazy again. However, unlike the previous negative statuses that could be removed with some power, this time the damage came from the curse of divine power. Although Barzab was the Lord of Hell, and his overall strength could defeat Kaji Luna, he had to pay a high price to remove these negative statuses. Now, not only did he have to face the Hell battle launched by Despot, but he also had to face 3 gods at the same time. If he continued to waste his power on things that had nothing to do with the battle, it would definitely affect the final balance of the battle. Having understood the knack behind it, Barzab, who had the upper body of a handsome fallen angel, could only roar helplessly. Ignoring the acne and pimples on his body and face, he cast a petrification spell on himself, changing his upper body into an elemental creature made of stone. choosing the lesser of two evils. Even if moss and mushrooms would grow out of the stone under the influence of the curse, it would still embarrass the fallen angel image he was so proud of in front of so many enemies. Chapter 999. Barzab felt terrible. In theory, his true body had already transformed into the soul-binding tower, and he could replenish his energy through the corruption magic that absorbed souls and even lives. Logic told him that before the army of hell arrived, he could not reveal his trump card in advance. Originally, under the circumstances where he did not reveal his trump card, the two foolish goblin gods were still very easy to deceive. However, ever since the appearance of the harpy goddess Kajiluna, the situation took a turn for the worse. There were a few times when he wanted to use his trump card to kill her. There was no other reason other than the fact that the detestable harpy goddess was simply too disgusting. First, she used the bite of 10,000 snakes. Then she used the old mud ball that had been cursed by divinity. Although the damage caused was not great, it hit his weak spot every time and violated his dignity. Helplessly, he could only cast the reverse curse of flesh and blood on himself, elementalizing his handsome and perfect body of flesh and blood, turning it into a rough and unpolished rock. But even so, the various acne, pimples, and psoriasis brought about by the divine curse still caused stone chips to fall off his body, ugly cracks to appear, and ugly moss to grow out of his body. When will the construction of that Hell Gate fortress be completed? Despat, how many troops have you prepared? Are you done yet? In the depths of his heart, Barzab kept roaring madly cursing his old nemesis that had been at loggerheads with him for many years. In order to prevent the three gods present from focusing on him, Barzab was really worried that the detestable harpy goddess would cast an even more disgusting negative status on him. He even wasted some of his energy and forcefully promoted the unreal demon that had been created using the soul of Medica's last pharaoh, Ma-Ko, into a powerful, unique demon. And after he killed the Lord of Fear that the bugbears had feared at lightning speed, Ma-Ko received a new order. The winged insect Lord directly asked him to challenge the avatars of the three gods. F***CK. Ma-Ko was already somewhat speechless. Those were three deities, not three cabbages. They were not existences that could be easily squashed. However, because his soul and true name were controlled by Barzab, this unlucky last pharaoh could only do as he was told. He charged straight towards the three gods. Krughek, the god of bugoblins, roared and raised his hammer. He smashed it hard on the unreal demon, who was already as enormous as an ancient red dragon, and forcibly interrupted Ma-Ko's spellcasting. Thousands of sea goblins, whose minds were replaced by the devil's soul pot at the same time, howled in pain and exploded into a pile of blood bubbles. The next to attack was the goblin god of slavery, Kugobayag. Since coming to the world of ashes for the first time, he stopped waving the whip and lashed Ma-Ko with it. This kind of whip, which contained divine power, was enough to make the unreal demon suffer so much that he almost wanted to end his own life. But it was precisely because Ma-Ko was the unreal demon that he could not die before he lost his unique characteristic. He could only use the way that mortals screamed to vent the pain from the depths of his soul. And this was not all, because the goddess of Hag also joined in the abuse. Ho ho! Ha ha! The blisters on Kaji Luna's throat and tongue had made it completely impossible for her to make sound. She could only make this kind of meaningless laughter. Of course, this little bit of pain on the avatar did not affect this god, who had similar magical priesthoods, such as curses and hag magic. She could still cast spells normally. Kaji Luna stretched out a withered finger with a sharp nail and shot out a command of death. In an instant, one of the 10 heads of the unreal demon, Ma-Ko, completely lost its vitality. Because divine power had the great power to change reality, Ma-Ko could not regenerate this head without the interference of divine power of the same level, nor could he take the initiative to remove it. If nothing went wrong, This necrotic head would accompany the illusory demon for the rest of his life. Not only would it make him a laughingstock in the future, it would also make him suffer the terrible pain of 1/10 of death every second. Although it was difficult to deal with Barzub, who was the Lord of Hell, the three evil gods showed their respective strengths when they were dealing with the unreal demon, who was a powerful evil demon in the eyes of many mortals and demons. However, it was also because they had a punching bag with enough meat that their real target, Barzub, who had transformed into a stone giant, was able to enjoy a moment of peace. Finally, the construction of the Hell's Gate fortress was completed. Accompanied by a long whistle, a bloodbath-level military channel finally connected the Bartholomew's 9 hells and the Ashen world. Before the organized demons stepped out of the passage, a strong airflow rushed out of the Hell Gate fortress. The advance party of devils standing guard outside the Hell Gate fortress were not surprised at all. In fact, they even seemed to enjoy the sight and took deep breaths. This was because the air pressure and temperature in the 9 prisons of Bader were much higher than most of the weak material planes. Therefore, after the Hell Gate fortress was connected, the air of the 9 prisons naturally surged out. In addition, this air current that carried toxins and high temperatures was highly lethal to weak creatures in weak material planes. Therefore, when conquering material planes, the devils would occasionally take the initiative to take advantage of this. Although the situation this time was a little different, and the 9 hells were connected to the material plane not to conquer it, but to kill a Lord of Hell, the moment the airflow surged in, the devils of Battersea were instinctively excited. They longed for a fierce battle. They longed for a glorious promotion. They longed to witness a miracle. An angry roar came from the Hell Gate fortress. This voice surprised the winged insect lord because he could tell that the owner of this voice was not Despat. Soon after, a huge devil that resembled a blood-red sandstorm was the first to charge out of the Hell Gate fortress. I challenge you to a duel. Barzub's eyes, which had turned into stone, stared intently, and only then did he recognize the person's identity. He was a unique demon who had left Batsu's normal ascension sequence, and his soul did not have the mark of a duke that other lords had left behind. In other words, this demon was an ambitious schemer who had been hiding in an unknown place in the 9 prisons. Unique demons like them who had not pledged allegiance to a Lord of Hell had the right to challenge and replace him. Despat, you despicable coward. Barzub came to a realization and hated the second Lord even more. It turned out that the other side had such a trick up their sleeves. Nobody knew how many of these unique demons there were, but each of them was eager to replace a Lord of Hell. They were trying to wear him down by taking turns to tire him out. Chapter 1000. That's exactly what I'm going to do. After being exiled by the Lord of the 9 hells for 3 days, do you think I'll use all my strength to kill you? Barzub, you're underestimating yourself. I'm very afraid of a powerful opponent like you. Standing at the top of the Iron Tower in the center of the displane, the second Lord Despat looked down at the private drill ground in his courtyard. There, a magnificent Hell Gate fortress had been erected. The private drill ground, which covered an area of tens of thousands of square kilometers, was filled with soldiers who were ready to go to war at any time. In front of these soldiers, there was a group of demons who were more powerful than ordinary demons. They were scattered around the vicinity of the Hell Gate fortress. All of them were hatchet men who had been encouraged or paid by Dispart to engage in a war of attrition. Without exception, these guys were the only demons who had not been conferred titles by the Lord. According to the hidden clause of the Codex of Hell, each of them was actually a potential candidate for the Lord of the 9 hells. As long as they succeeded in the challenge, they could take up the position, as they were very powerful, and, at the same time, they were not under the direct jurisdiction of Despat's military order. Therefore, the second Lord subordinate, the Duke of Maroda, had personally come to maintain order. Miranda had the body of a wolf, a pair of huge wings, and a coiled tail of a serpent. He was a unique demon. On top of his head was a pair of huge and extended longhorns. He could turn both horns slightly to attack the same enemy. This pair of long horns had a unique characteristic. As long as the target was touched by it, even if it was the incarnation of a god, it would be forced to undergo a fear appraisal. In the past, in the Blood War and the battle with the Upper Realm, Maroda had a glorious battle record of forcing the Lord of the Abyss or the incarnation of a god to turn around and flee by just using the horns. It was precisely because of this that he was sent by the Lord Despot to maintain order in the field. If the lone demons dared to attack, Maroda would lower his head. As a clumsy flyer, Maroda preferred to run on all fours. He circled around the dozen lone devils. Maroda's snake-like tail was wrapped around an enchanted halberd. If the angle didn't settle them down, then Maroda would switch to serious combat mode at any time. He would stand up and grab the weapon with his front claws to intimidate them. However, in order to fight Barzab one after another, Despot had found too many helpers. In the face of more than a dozen powerful demons, with only one Grand Duke, Maroda, holding the line, it was inevitable that he would lose sight of one. The moment the Hell Gate fortress opened, a gale carrying the aura of hell rushed into the fortress. A lone desolate devil that looked like a living sandstorm rose with the wind without waiting for Despot's order, and rushed into the door that connected to the Ashes world in a slightly crazy manner. "Damn Barbados! Obey the order!" Seeing this, the Duke of Hell, Maroda, roared angrily. In a moment of desperation, he didn't run on all fours. In an instant, he teleported behind Barbados, wanting to use his horns to teach the other party a lesson. But who would have thought that his attack would hit nothing? The moment the desolate devil was touched by his horns, his form actually shifted, and a large part of his waist caved in, narrowly avoiding the attack. "Barzab, I want to challenge you." Barbados didn't pay attention to Maroda at all. He only let out a roar, and then whistled through the Hell Gate fortress, leaving Maroda, who was about to explode in anger, in Despot's private courtyard. "Let's see who dares to not line up." Sir Lord said, "To enter the car, wheel, battle." Maroda roared angrily. His wolf-like head also became many times larger, causing his roar to become even more ear-piercing. At the same time, accompanied by a series of whoosh, whoosh, whoosh sounds of air friction, more than 30 companies of elite barbed demon guards appear beside the Duke of Hell. This was the guard that the Second Lord had specially prepared for the Duke of Maroda. Seeing this, the other lone devils stopped laughing and joking. They followed the rules and stood obediently in their positions. After all, although they were looking forward to the next challenge, to be honest, none of them were as anxious as Barbados. This was because the reason why Barbados wanted to challenge Barzab, other than wanting to kill him to ascend to the throne of the Lord of Hell, there was another reason. The desolate devil had a crush on the Seventh Lord's quiet spouse, Baptiste. For this love, he naturally had to do his best to fight for the chance to kill Barzab. Devils were the typical creatures of order. Coupled with their evil nature, sometimes, even if they had some normal feelings, they would immediately change. For example, because he had a crush on Baptiste, he wanted to kill her spouse Barzab, not to mention the probability of success for a desolate devil like him. Even if he succeeded, would Baptiste remarry? This was purely a joke. Which marriage in the 9 prisons of Bader did not have a righteous factor and exchange of benefits behind it. What good would killing Barzab do to Baptiste if she would favor a small fry like Barbados who might be replaced one day? But even so, Barbados still rushed out of Hell Castle without hesitation. The moment he appeared in the Ashen world, he turned into yellow sand that blotted out the sky and covered the earth, whistling as he pounced on his imaginary love rival. Sand particles suddenly appeared in the air within a radius of tens of kilometers, and even a layer of sand accumulated on the surface of the sea. Many sea goblins who did not have time to hide in the deep water were instantly covered by the sand. They looked like yam eggs that had just been dug out of the sand. What was even more terrifying was that the god of goblin slavery who had summoned them immediately discovered that this group of yam eggs had all died of dehydration. In other words, the moment this powerful desolate devil appeared, He had already killed many of his allies before dealing any damage to Barzab. Love could make a person fearless, but similarly, love could only make a desolate devil. Barzab, you must die today. In a sandstorm, Barbado's voice sounded from all directions. In the blink of an eye, two sandstone sabers that were dozens of meters long appeared amidst the sandstorm. As if guided by an invisible hand, the sabers spun and slashed at Barzab, who had already turned into a rock. Sparks flew from the insect lord's body in an instant. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.